Smelter smoke hung over Leadville in a yellow sheet that turned the November light the color of old brass. Below town, where California Gulch bent south past the last slag heaps, the smoke thinned and the cold came through clean, sharp enough to split a lip, dry enough to crack boot leather in a week. A woman stood inside a roofless rectangle of dark brick, her hand pressed flat against the wall. She held it there the way a person holds a hand to a sick child's forehead, not to fix anything, but to know. Behind her, on the firebrick floor, a trunk sat beside a single folded blanket. Nothing else. Marit Brecka had arrived in Leadville, Colorado, 14 months before the town decided she was finished. She came with her husband Anders on a freight wagon in September of 1886, sitting on a trunk that held everything they owned, watching the sky turn the color of tin as the road climbed above 10,000 feet. Anders had a letter promising work at the Little Dipper drift mine. Marit had 2 hands, a strong back, and the understanding carried from her father's house in Telemark that heat was not something you chased, but something you taught stone to hold. None of that mattered now. Anders Brecka was dead. A mine timber collapse at the Little Dipper had crushed him on a Tuesday in late October of 1887, and the mining company's foreman had delivered the news to Marit at the boarding house with his hat in his hands and a debt note where the death payment should have been. Anders owed the company store $11.40. The foreman said the mine owner would confirm fault before releasing any wages owed. He did not say when. He did not look at her face while he spoke. 3 days. That was what Mrs. Garfield, the boarding house keeper, gave her. 3 days before the bed went to a paying man. Mrs. Garfield was not cruel about it. She set a cup of weak coffee on the table and said, "I have 6 waiting, Marit. I cannot hold a bed on sympathy." The cup cost 2 cents. Marit drank it because refusing felt like the beginning of something she could not afford to start. She counted what she had on the boarding house steps while frost crept along the planks. $6.80 in coin and scrip, 1 patched wool skirt, 1 wool bodice mended twice at the elbows, 1 trunk with a broken clasp, 2 blankets, 1 thick and 1 thin, a tin cup, a handsaw with 3 teeth missing from the blade, a letter from a cousin in Denver that had arrived 2 weeks too late to change anything, no children, no family within 500 miles, no claim on anything except what she could carry. The town moved around her like water around a post. Ore wagons ground down Harrison Avenue. Smelter smoke rolled east in a yellow sheet. Men walked to shifts at the Matchless, the Iron Silver, the Morning Star, and they did not look at the Norwegian widow sitting on a trunk because widows in Leadville were as common as broken shovels. More common, a broken shovel could still be sold for scrap. She could not leave. Passage to Denver on the Denver and Rio Grande cost more than she held. The railroad agent at the depot told her credit required a guarantor, and she had none. Walking was not a choice either. November at 10,000 feet meant ice on the roads, snow closing Mosquito Pass within weeks, and a woman alone on foot between Leadville and the next settlement carried the kind of odds that did not need calculating. She had asked at the church. The deaconess said the mission room had space, but the mission room was managed by a man named Virgil Fenton, who was Martin Quade's cousin, and Marit had already heard what Quade said about debts and widows and the price of cooperation. She would sleep under Quade's accounting, or she would sleep nowhere, so she chose nowhere. The abandoned smelter sat a quarter-mile east of town, past the last slag heaps where California Gulch bent south. It had been the Consolidated Mineral Works, a small custom smelting operation that processed ore from 3 independent claims until the claims played out and the investors pulled their money in 1885. What remained was a roofless rectangle of dark refractory brick, 30 inches thick at the base, enclosing a space roughly 30 feet by 40 feet. The walls stood 8 feet high on the north and west sides, lower on the east where weather and scavengers had pulled courses loose. The floor was industrial firebrick, yellow, dense, scarred with old slag runs and patches of white glass that caught the light like dirty mirrors. A furnace throat rose on the north wall, its iron damper long stolen, its clay lining cracked but mostly intact. The draft channel ran up through the wall at an angle and open to sky. Nobody wanted it. The brick was too heavy to haul without a wagon, and the nearest working smelter already had refractory stock. Scrap pickers had taken the iron, the copper fittings, the door hinges, and anything that could be carried by hand. What was left was weight. Dead, roofless, industrial weight sitting in a gulch where the wind came through like a river. Marit found it on her second day without a bed. She had walked east because east meant fewer people, and fewer people meant fewer questions about where a widow was sleeping. She climbed a slag ridge and looked down into the ruin and saw walls. Not thin cabin walls, not tar paper walls. Walls thicker than her arm was long. She climbed down and pressed her palm to the brick. It was cold. Of course it was cold. November in Leadville meant everything was cold, but the brick was not as cold as the air. She held her hand against it and felt the difference the way her father had taught her to feel it, not with a thermometer, not with a word, but with skin. The brick was surrendering yesterday's weak sun more slowly than the dirt, more slowly than the timber scraps piled against the east wall, more slowly than the air itself. She did not decide anything in that moment. She sat against the wall and pulled her blankets around her shoulders and watched Smelter smoke drift across the stars and tried not to think about Anders or the debt note or Mrs. Garfield's face when she said 6 waiting. She failed at all 3. But she slept, and when she woke before dawn with frost on her blanket and her breath hanging white, the brick beside her shoulder blade was still not as cold as the ground beneath her. That was the first morning. Evan Pritchard found her on the 3rd morning. He was 56 years old, Welsh-born, heavy through the shoulders in the way that men who have lifted brick their entire lives become heavy without becoming fat. He had worked as a furnace mason at the old Consolidated Works, then at the Arkansas Valley Smelter, then at the Harrison Reduction Works until his knees told him ladders were finished. Now he estimated furnace repairs for whoever would hire a man who moved slowly and argued about mortar. He came down the slag road carrying a canvas bag of tools and saw smoke rising from behind the smelter wall, not stovepipe smoke, twig smoke, thin, white, directionless. He walked to the gap in the east wall and found a woman crouched over a palm-sized fire built directly on the firebrick floor, heating water in a tin cup. He stood in the gap and looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the walls, the open sky, the cracked furnace throat, the slag on the floor, the wind cutting through every opening that had once held iron fittings. He looked back at Marit. "You cannot live here," Pritchard said. Marit did not answer. She had learned in 14 months that answering cost energy she could not spare. Pritchard set his tool bag down and walked the perimeter. He was not being kind. He was being thorough in the way that masons are thorough, checking walls the way other men checked horses by touch and habit. He tapped brick with his knuckle. He pressed mortar joints with his thumb. He crouched at the base and sighted along the footing. 30-inch refractory walls, he said, as if reading an invoice. Good fireclay brick, Stourbridge pattern, probably shipped from St. Louis. Floor's the same, 4 inches thick on a rubble bed. Furnace throat is cracked at the second course, but the draft channel is intact. North and west walls are sound. East wall has lost 6 courses above the fitting line. No roof, no door, no stove, no pipe. He He stood and brushed his hands on his trousers. "A person needs a tight roof over a raised floor," Pritchard said. "An iron stove with pipe drawing clean, 6 cords of dry fuel stacked and covered, and neighbors close enough to hear shouting when trouble comes." He looked at the open sky. "You have none of those." "I have walls," Marit said. "You have a furnace bay," Pritchard said. "A furnace keeps heat when men feed it ore and coke by the ton, day and night, with bellows forcing air through a charge. You have twigs." He picked up his tool bag. He was not angry. He was not dismissive in the way that cruelty is dismissive. He was stating a professional assessment the way he would state that a cracked furnace needed relining, not as an opinion, but as a measurement. "The cold here kills people who have stoves and roofs and 6 cords of pine," Pritchard said. "It kills them because a stove heats air, and air leaves through every crack. A person with no roof is not fighting cold. She's standing in it." He walked back toward the slag road. At the gap in the wall, he stopped. "Which bay are you in?" "The north one," Marit said. "Where the furnace throat is." Pritchard looked at the north bay, the smaller section, roughly 12 by 16 feet, bounded on 3 sides by the thickest walls and backed against the furnace throat. He said nothing for several seconds. "That is the only bay with leeward walls and a working draft channel," he said. "You picked the only bay worth picking." Then he left. Marit sat with her tin cup and watched his heavy shape climb the slag road. He had not offered help. He had not offered sympathy. He had told her exactly how far she stood from survival, and then noticed that she had already made one correct decision. She pressed her palm to the firebrick floor. The spot where her small fire had burned was warm. The spot 3 feet away was cold, but the spot 6 inches from the ash, the spot where heat had crawled through dense refractory clay for hours, was something else. Not warm, not cold, holding. The brick was holding. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a contradiction she could not stop noticing. On the 4th morning, Marit woke to find frost on everything. Her blanket, her trunk, the slag glass, the rubble, the weeds growing through the east wall gap. Everything except a circle of firebrick surrounding the dead ash of last night's fire. The frost line was visible. She could see exactly where the brick's stored heat had kept the air above freezing and where it had not. She built 3 small fires that afternoon, one on bare dirt outside the wall, one on ordinary rubble stone inside the ruin, one on the yellow refractory brick of the furnace floor. Beside each fire, she placed her tin cup filled with snow. She let the fires burn to ash and watched. The snow beside the dirt fire melted first. The snow beside the rubble melted second. The snow beside the refractory brick melted last. She noted this without understanding it. But then she waited. The dirt went cold in an hour. The puddle beside it froze by evening. The rubble held warmth longer, perhaps 2 hours, and its puddle grew a skin of ice before dark. The refractory brick still held warmth at dusk. Its puddle stayed liquid. She pressed her palms to the yellow surface and felt the heat moving out of the brick so slowly that it seemed reluctant, like something being poured from a heavy vessel, not rushing, leaking. Memory came without invitation. Her father, Halvor Brecka, in the stone bakery at Kvitteseed. He had fired the communal oven for 6 hours, scraped the coals, sealed the mouth with clay and wet burlap, and baked rye for the next 8 hours on nothing but the heat the masonry had swallowed. She remembered pressing her palm to the wall beside the oven mouth and feeling warmth move through stone as if the stone were breathing it out. Her father had said something she carried without knowing she carried it. A poor family does not waste heat into air. Air forgets. Stone remembers. Marit looked at the furnace bay. 30-inch refractory walls on 3 sides, a 4-inch firebrick floor, a furnace throat and draft channel designed to move hot air through masonry, 12 feet by 16 feet, the smallest, most enclosed space in the ruin. She did not need to heat air. She needed to heat mass. A large fire in an iron stove heated air. Air rose, hit the ceiling, lost heat to the roof, and escaped through every crack. The stove had to keep burning because the air kept leaving. 6 cords of wood for a winter meant 6 cords of heat sent upward, outward, and gone. But if she roofed this bay, sealed it with something heavy enough to stop warm air from rising through, and built her fire on the firebrick floor, the heat would go down and sideways into refractory brick designed to absorb furnace temperatures. The brick would charge slowly, the way her father's oven charged, and it would discharge slowly. The tiny interior space, not a cabin, not a house, a chamber, would stay warm not because the fire was large, but because the walls and floor refused to let go. The fire could be small. The fire had to be small. She did not have 6 cords. She did not have 1 cord. She had twigs, brush, scrap wood, and coal crumbs scavenged from the slag road. In a cabin with a stove, that fuel would last 2 days. In a sealed brick chamber with 3 feet of earth overhead, it might last all winter. Might. Ada Meeker came through the east wall gap on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a bundle of wet laundry and a face that said she had been watching for days. Ada was 31, born in Ohio, widowed once and abandoned once, which in Leadville made her experienced rather than unfortunate. She ran a wash tub operation from a tar paper shack near the creek and charged 4 cents a shirt, which kept her alive in the same way that treading water kept a person above the surface. Technically functional, with no margin for anything going wrong. She found Marit dragging a green lodgepole sapling across the firebrick floor and measuring it against the north wall. "What are you building?" Ada asked. "A roof," Marit said. Ada looked up at the open sky. She looked at the 30-inch walls. She looked at the single green sapling. "With what? Sticks and prayers?" "Saplings," Marit said. "Cross-laid with willow brush, then burlap, then hay, then 3 feet of packed dirt." Ada set the laundry down. She was not a woman who softened her opinions for the sake of politeness. She had survived Leadville by being right about things more often than she was wrong, and she intended to be right now. "A roof sheds snow," Ada said. "It sheds rain. It sheds weight. You are telling me you want to pile weight on top of weight and call that shelter." "My father's bakery held 12 inches of sod," Marit said. "Your father's bakery was not a mining camp ruin held together by old mortar and slag." Marit did not argue. She lit a small handful of twigs in the fire pit, a 20-inch ring of firebrick she had cleared and leveled, and waited. Smoke rose, curled against the north wall, found the cracked furnace throat, and hesitated. Ada watched the smoke pool along the ceiling line, thickening. "That will kill you," Ada said. "Smoke in a closed room kills faster than cold." Marit opened the throat wider using a flat stone as a lever. The smoke paused, shifted, then drew. The draft channel pulled it up and out through the wall. The air cleared in 30 seconds. "The throat draws," Marit said. "In calm air," Ada said. "Wind from the northeast will push it back down. Wind from the west will pull too hard and steal your heat. And when 3 feet of dirt sits on this roof and snow packs on top of the dirt, that throat will be 6 feet underground. What happens then?" Marit did not have an answer. She had not thought about the vent under snow. She had thought about walls and mass and slow heat, and she had not thought about the thing that would kill her if she forgot it. Ada picked up her laundry. At the gap in the wall, she turned. "I am not saying you are wrong," Ada said. "I am saying you will not live long enough to find out if you are right." She left. Marit sat in the furnace bay and stared at the draft throat and felt the fear Ada had put there settle into her chest like ice water. The smoke problem was real. The snow burial problem was real. The roof weight problem was real. Every one of those problems could kill her, and she had answers for none of them. But she also had no money for a stove, no money for a cabin, no money for 6 cords of wood, no money for passage to Denver, no credit, no family, no employer, and a debt note filed against her husband's name that a man named Martin Quaid was already asking about. She could solve the problem she could see, or she could surrender to the problem she could not afford. She picked up the sapling and measured it again. Martin Quaid walked into the smelter yard on a Friday, flanked by 2 men Marit did not recognize. Quaid was 44, built like a barrel left in the rain, swollen, hard-surfaced, useful to someone. He bought salvage. He invested in rooming houses. He collected debts informally, which meant he collected debts the way a river collects what fell in upstream, without asking and without giving back. He owned a share of the boarding house where Marit had been evicted, and a share of the mercantile where her credit had been denied, and he had been asking questions about the abandoned smelter claim since the day Marit set foot in the ruin. His interest was not in Marit. His interest was in the brick. Refractory firebrick from a Stourbridge pattern furnace was worth money to any working smelter that needed relining. The Consolidated Mineral Works had been abandoned without formal salvage claims filed, which meant the brick sat in legal twilight, belonging to no one, and therefore available to the first person with a wagon and enough indifference to take it. Marit's presence complicated this. A widow squatting in a ruin had no legal claim, but she had moral weight in a town that still sent its daughters to Sunday school. Removing her by force would cost Quaid more in reputation than the brick was worth. So he had come to buy her out. He stood in the furnace bay and looked at the saplings Marit had begun laying across the walls. He looked at the fire pit. He looked at the burlap she had spread across one corner. He looked at her. "The brick in this foundation is worth more than you are," Quaid said. He did not say it with cruelty. He said it with the flat accuracy of a man who priced everything and found most things wanting. "I'm offering $3 for your right to squat here," Quaid said. "You take $3, you sleep at the mission until spring, and you find work washing or sorting or whatever it is Norwegian women do. The brick goes to the Harrison Works, and everybody profits." "I am not leaving," Marit said. Quaid looked at the open sky where the roof should have been. He looked at the 3 saplings laid across the shortest span. He looked at the tin cup, the blankets, the small ash pile. "You will crawl back before the real snow," Quaid said. "You will crawl back because a human being cannot live in a furnace grave with a willow stick roof and a handful of twigs. When you crawl back, I will buy the brick after. The price will not be $3 then. It will be whatever I decide." He adjusted his hat. His 2 men, one a hauler named Reuben Stoll, the other a clerk Marit had seen at the mercantile, said nothing. They were not required to speak. Their presence was the statement. "Think about it," Quaid said, as if she had not already said no. They left through the east wall gap. Marit listened to their boots crunching on slag until the sound dissolved into the wind. Her hands were shaking, and not from cold. She pressed them flat against the fire brick floor and held them there until the trembling stopped. She had said no. Now she had to be right. Evan Pritchard stood on the slag road above the ruin and watched Quaid's men leave. He had been on his way to check a chimney at the Harrison Works and had stopped when he heard voices. He did not come down. He did not offer help. He stood with his tool bag and his professional skepticism and watched the woman below begin to measure another sapling against the north wall. She was not guessing wildly. He could see that. She had selected the smallest bay. She had placed the fire on the refractory floor, not on dirt. She had opened the furnace throat and tested the draw. She was laying saplings perpendicular to the shortest span, which was the correct orientation for a beam under load. She was doing these things the way someone does things they have seen done before, not perfectly, but with the memory of correctness guiding the hands. He did not believe the roof would hold. Green lodgepole saplings, 6 inches in diameter, would sag under 3 feet of wet earth before the first week ended. The mortar joints would crack. The smoke would kill her, or the cold would kill her, or the weight would kill her, and the whole camp would shake its head and say they had warned her. But she had picked the only bay with a leeward wall and a working draft channel. She had placed the fire on the refractory floor. She had tested the draw. Pritchard adjusted his tool bag on his shoulder and walked toward the Harrison works. He did not come down to the ruin. Not yet. But he came back 2 days later. He found Marit trying to wedge a sapling into a gap between wall courses, using the brick as a bearing surface. The sapling was too long. She had no way to cut it cleanly with a 3-toothed saw. The bark was slick with sap, and the wood kept sliding off the wall before she could set the next one. Pritchard stood in the gap and watched her fail 3 times. On the 4th attempt, the sapling fell and hit her shoulder. She caught it before it struck the floor and set it back against the wall without making a sound. "You are bridging a 12-foot span with green wood and no center support," Pritchard said. "It will sag 2 inches in a week and 4 inches in a month. By January, the middle of your roof will be sitting on your head." "I know," Marit said. "You know, and you are doing it anyway." "I do not have a center post." Pritchard set his tool bag down. He walked to the north wall and pressed his palm to the brick the way he had done on his first visit, reading the wall-like text. He tapped. He pressed. He sighted along the top course. "There is a collapsed ore trestle behind the Harrison slag dump," Pritchard said. 8x8 pine timber, most of it split. One piece near the south end is sound. It has been sitting on rubble long enough that no one will miss it. If you cut it to 7 feet and set it on a flat stone in the center of this bay, your saplings span 6 feet instead of 12. Green wood will hold 6 feet. He said this the way he said everything, as a technical specification, not a kindness. "I cannot carry an 8x8 timber alone," Marit said. "No," Pritchard said. "You cannot." He did not move. She did not move. The wind came through the east wall gap and scattered ash from the fire pit across the yellow brick floor. "I will help you carry the post," Pritchard said, "because you listen to brick better than most men listen to orders, and because if you die in this ruin from a sagging roof, the town will say Evan Pritchard watched it happen. I will not carry that." This was not charity. Marit understood that immediately. Pritchard was protecting his reputation and satisfying his professional conscience. He had seen a woman doing masonry-adjacent work badly, and the part of him that had spent 40 years building things would not allow it to continue without correction. They retrieved the center post that afternoon. It took 3 hours. The timber weighed more than Marit did. They dragged it on a plank sled across the slag field, and by the time they set it upright in the furnace bay on a flat foundation stone, Marit's right shoulder was bruised black from collarbone to arm, and Pritchard's knees had swollen to the point where he sat on the floor and did not stand for 20 minutes. He taught her the first lesson while sitting on the firebrick floor, catching his breath. "Smoke needs a path," Pritchard said. He pulled a candle stub from his tool bag and lit it. He held it near the furnace throat and watched the flame bend. When the flame pulls toward the throat, the draft is drawing. When it stands straight, The air is dead. When it pushes away, you have backdraft and you are breathing your own fire. He moved the candle around the throat opening. You need to open this wider. The clay lining is cracked here and here. He pointed. Clean it with a chisel, not a hammer. You will break the channel. A chisel, working the crack line. Give the smoke a clear path and it will take it. Block the path and it will find you instead. Marit memorized the flame angles. She did not write them down. She did not need to. Her father had taught her to read fire the same way, by watching which direction it reached. The second lesson came the next day, when Pritchard returned with a plumb bob and a straight edge. Your saplings must carry weight to the walls, not hang it from the middle, he said. He showed her how to lay the largest saplings perpendicular to the shortest span, resting on the 30-inch wall tops, with the center post taking the midpoint load. He made her check each sapling by setting one end on the wall and hanging her full weight from the middle. 2 saplings cracked. She discarded them. Dirt roof weight must spread, Pritchard said. Every pound on the roof pushes down and out. If the weight concentrates in the middle falls. If it spreads to the walls hold because they are 30 inches of firebrick with nowhere to go. He showed her the layering. Saplings first, then cross-lattice willow tied with baling wire at every intersection, then brush packed tight, then burlap or sacks overlapping like shingles, then prairie hay, then broken board scavenged from the slag heap, then earth. 3 feet of packed earth over the sleeping area, 2 feet over the rest. Each layer stops what the layer below lets through, Pritchard said. Saplings stop dirt. Willow stops brush from falling between saplings. Burlap stops hay from washing through willow. Hay stops dirt from settling through burlap. Boards stop heavy dirt from pressing hay flat. This is not a roof. It is a sieve run backwards. He taught the third lesson that afternoon. Thermal sealing. Every crack in the wall was a thief. Warm air rising from the heated firebrick floor would find the smallest gap and escape through it, and a small fire could not replace what a dozen cracks stole. Mortar, Pritchard said. He mixed a paste on the firebrick floor, clay from the creek bank, wood ash, crushed refractory brick dust, and horsehair pulled from a brush. He pressed it into a wall crack with his thumb and smoothed it with a wooden paddle. You fill every crack you can see. Then you light a fire and watch where the smoke moves. Where the smoke slides along a wall, there is a crack you missed. Fill that too. Marit worked beside him, filling cracks, watching his hands, learning the pressure and the angle. Her father had mortared stone. Pritchard mortared brick. The principle was the same. Close the path that heat would use to escape. By the end of that day, the north wall was sealed from floor to the top course. Marit's hands were raw. Pritchard's knees were worse. They sat on opposite sides of the fire pit and ate nothing because neither had brought food and neither would admit it. The brick will hold heat if you give it heat to hold, Pritchard said. But do not make a large fire. A large fire heats air. You do not want to heat air. You want to heat the floor. Small fires, repeated. Feed the brick the way you feed a sick animal, small and steady, not all at once. He left at dusk. At the gap in the wall, he turned. You are still going to die here, he said. But you will die in a better built ruin than I expected. Progress came in measurements, and every measurement was a race against the calendar. Day 3 after Pritchard's arrival, the floor was cleared of slag glass and loose rubble. Marit scraped the firebrick surface with a broken shovel until the yellow clay face was exposed across the entire bay. Her palms split open on the second day of scraping. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her thin blanket and kept working. Day 6. The west wall was patched from floor to top course, 14 cracks filled with Pritchard's mortar. Marit tested each one with a candle flame that evening and found 3 she had missed. She filled them by lamplight, which meant she used 3 inches of candle she could not replace. Day 8. The roof lattice was half laid. 11 saplings spanning the short dimension, resting on wall tops, supported at the midpoint by the salvaged center post. Willow cross lattice tied at every junction with baling wire she had bought for 15 cents at Bell's Mercantile, the last purchase the store would allow her before her credit closed. Day 10. The furnace throat drew clean for the first time. Pritchard had returned to supervise the chiseling. Marit opened the cracked clay lining along the fracture lines, widened the channel by 2 inches, and smoothed the interior with wet clay. She lit a test fire. The smoke hesitated, curled, then rose into the throat and disappeared. Outside, a thin white line climbed from the wall into the gray sky. Pritchard watched the smoke from the slag road. He did not come down. He nodded once, which Marit did not see, and walked away. Day 12. The dirt cover reached 8 inches over the sleeping bay. Not enough. Marit carried earth in a flour sack, 60 to 80 pounds per load, from a creek bank cut 300 yards south. She counted loads. 19 loads that day, 19 trips, each one uphill across slag rubble, each one heavier than the last as the path turned to ice under her feet. Her wool skirt froze stiff at the hem by mid-morning and stayed frozen until she crawled into the bay at dusk. She had traded her thin blanket for a sharper saw the day before. She regretted it every night. One thick blanket between her body and the cold brick floor was not enough. She laid burlap under the blanket and scrap brush under the burlap and slept in her boots and skirt and bodice and shawl and still woke shivering at 3 in the morning. But the firebrick floor where her fire had burned held warmth until 2. She knew because she pressed her hand to it every time she woke. At midnight, warm. At 1, warm. At 2, fading. At 3, cold. 2 degrees of progress. The floor was remembering longer. Boys from town came twice. The first time they threw slag pebbles over the wall and ran. The second time they stole 2 saplings from the pile Marshart had cut and stacked beside the east wall. She found the empty space in the morning and stood there with her raw hands at her sides, and did not cry because she could not afford the salt. A thaw came on day 11 and turned the earth pile to mud. Each load doubled in weight. The path became a slick trench. Marit fell twice. The second fall drove her knee into a slag edge and opened a cut that bled through her skirt. She packed it with clay and kept carrying. One section of the roof lattice sagged 2 inches overnight. The center sapling had taken moisture and bent under the partial dirt load. Pritchard, arriving the next morning with his tool bag, saw the sag and said nothing for a full minute. "Replace it," he said, "before you add more weight." Replacing it meant removing 8 inches of packed earth, untying the cross lattice, pulling the bent sapling, cutting a new one, and relaying everything. It cost her an entire day. And then Quaid filed a complaint at the town clerk's office claiming that Marit was stripping company property by using the smelter's firebrick. The complaint had no legal weight. The Consolidated Mineral Works had been dissolved without a salvage claim, but it forced the town constable to walk down to the ruin and ask Marit questions she did not have time to answer. She answered them anyway. She showed the constable the walls, the roof, the fire pit. She said she had not removed a single brick. She had only sealed the cracks. The constable looked at the dirt on her hands and the cut on her knee and the single blanket folded on the floor and wrote something in a notebook and left. That night, Marit built her small fire and lay on the firebrick floor and listened to the wind testing every gap in the walls. The temperature outside was 9 degrees above zero. Inside, near the fire, it was not warm. It was less cold. She could feel the difference in her bones, in the way her muscles did not seize as hard, in the way her breath did not hang as thick. Not enough? Not yet. But holding. If you have ever built something while the people around you said it was foolish, if you have ever kept working because you knew something they did not, tell us about it in the comments. Because what Marit Breka was building and what the town could not see was about to be tested in a way that no one in that camp expected. Day 15, 3 feet of packed earth over the sleeping bay, 2 feet over the rest. The entrance was a gap in the east wall covered by a double blanket hung from a salvaged iron rod. The fire pit was 20 inches wide, ringed with firebrick, fed by handfuls of twigs and coal crumbs no bigger than a child's fist. The furnace bay was sealed. The roof was laid. The walls were mortared. The throat drew clean. And winter, the real winter, the winter that came down from the continental divide like something with weight and intent, was 3 weeks away, maybe 2. The freight office reported ice on Mosquito Pass. The telegraph operator said storms had closed roads in Wyoming and dropped cattle in frozen pastures across the northern range. Men at Bell's Mercantile talked about a front building in the mountains the way they talked about mine collapses, not with fear exactly, but with the resigned attention of people who lived inside something that could kill them at any time. Ada Meeker came to the ruin after dark, carrying 3 ore sacks and a coil of baling wire. She stood in the entrance gap and looked at the roof, solid, dark, already dusted with a skim of frost that would not melt until spring. She looked at the fire pit, the glow of twigs reflecting off yellow brick. She looked at Marit, who was sitting against the north wall with her raw hands wrapped in burlap, feeding the fire like a clock. "I still think you are half mad," Ada said. "Half is generous," Marit said. Ada dropped the ore sacks and the wire on the floor. "Mad is warmer than proud, maybe." She turned to leave, then stopped. "If your roof falls in, I will say I told you so at your funeral." "If my roof falls in," Marit said, "I will not hear you." Ada left. Marit uncoiled the baling wire and cut it into lengths with the edge of the broken shovel. 3 ore sacks, stretched and doubled, would cover the entrance gap better than a blanket. The wire would reinforce 2 sagging lattice points on the east side of the roof. Small things. Necessary things. Outside, the wind shifted north, and the temperature dropped 4 degrees in an hour. Inside, the firebrick floor held steady. The walls held steady. The 3 feet of packed earth overhead held steady. But steady was not enough. Steady was the promise. The test was coming, and the test would not ask whether Marit's shelter could hold warmth and calm air on a mild night with a small fire burning. The test would ask whether 30-inch refractory walls and a dirt roof and a handful of twigs could keep a human body alive when the mountain opened its throat and screamed. Marit fed the fire. The brick drank the heat. The clock kept running. The 4th lesson came on day 17, and it nearly ended the partnership before it became one. Pritchard arrived at dawn carrying a buckskin pouch of horsehair and a mason's chisel wrapped in oilcloth. He found Marit building a fire the size of a dinner plate, stacking kindling in a cone, lighting it from the base, feeding it with wrist-thick branches scavenged from the creek bottom. The flames climbed 2 feet. Smoke billowed against the ceiling before finding the throat. The firebrick floor around the pit darkened with soot. Pritchard crouched at the entrance and watched the fire burn for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he crossed the bay in 4 steps and kicked the burning wood apart with his boot. Sparks scattered across the floor. Marit jumped back. A coal bounced against the north wall and died in the mortar line. "What are you doing?" Marit said. "Saving you from yourself." Pritchard picked up the scattered sticks and threw them outside through the entrance gap. What did I tell you about fire size? Small fires. Repeated. That was not a small fire. That was a bonfire in a brick room. You heated the air for 20 minutes and the brick for 2. Every scrap of warmth went up the throat with the smoke. He pointed at the ceiling where heat stains were already fading. Air forgets. I told you that. Your father told you that. You know it, and you built that fire anyway because you were cold and afraid, and a large fire feels like safety. He was not gentle. His voice carried the blunt cadence of a man who had watched furnace workers waste fuel for 40 years and had stopped being patient about it somewhere around year 15. Thumb-sized pieces, Pritchard said. A handful at a time. You're not heating a room. You're feeding a floor. The floor does not need a bonfire. It needs time. He knelt on the fire brick and arranged 6 twigs, each the length and width of his thumb, in a loose cross. He lit them with a match. The flame was barely visible. A blue curl of heat close to the brick surface, more glow than fire. Smoke was almost non-existent. What rose was mostly warm air, and the throat took it quietly. Leave it, Pritchard said. When those burn down, wait. Put your hand on the floor. When the brick is cool enough that you cannot feel warmth, add 6 more. Not before. That will take all day. Yes, and tomorrow the floor will still be warm when you wake. Marit stared at the tiny fire. It looked like nothing. It looked like giving up. Every instinct built by 14 months in Leadville, a town of roaring smelters and bellowing stoves and smoke thick enough to taste, told her that heat required fire, and fire meant flame, and flame meant fuel piled high and burning hard. Pritchard read her face. A furnace mason spends his life putting heat where it belongs, he said. Inside the brick, not above it, not around it, not escaping through the chimney while the foreman shouts for more coke. Inside. The brick does the work. You just have to be patient enough to let it. He left his chisel with her to clean the lower throat. At the entrance gap, he said, Do not build another bonfire. I will know, because the soot pattern will tell me. She did not build another bonfire. She built 13 small fires that day, each one a fistful of thumb-length twigs, each one barely visible against the yellow brick. She pressed her palm to the floor between fires and felt the change. Not warmth, not yet, but resistance. The brick was pushing back against her cold hand instead of matching it. By evening, the floor around the fire pit held a radius of something that was not heat and not cold, but the memory of heat refusing to leave. She slept better that night than any night since Anders died. Not well, better. The difference between freezing and merely shivering. Day 18 brought the 5th lesson, and with it, the last piece of the design. Pritchard sat inside the sealed bay and watched Marit feed the fire. He approved the size. He checked the throat draw with his candle flame. He pressed his palm to the floor in 3 places and said nothing, which Marit had learned meant he found the results acceptable. Then he pointed at the entrance gap. You have sealed the walls. You have sealed the roof. You have a working throat, and you have a blanket hanging over a hole in the wall. I have 3 ore sacks now, Marit said. Ada brought them. 3 ore sacks over a hole in the wall, Pritchard corrected. Every time you enter, you bring the gulch in with you. Cold air pours across the floor and pushes the warm air up. The throat takes the warm air, and the cold air stays. You are losing heat every time you move. He described the fix. A double baffle. 2 blanket walls hung 18 inches apart, creating a narrow passage between the outside air and the interior. A person entered through the outer blanket, stood in the gap, let the outer blanket fall closed, then pushed through the inner blanket. The dead air pocket between the layers acted as a lock. A vestibule, Marit said. A common-sense door that any miner's wife would have built 3 weeks ago, Pritchard said. But yes. They built it that afternoon using the 3 ore sacks, 2 salvaged boards, and baling wire. The boards framed the gap. The ore sacks hung in 2 layers with a gap wide enough for Marit's shoulders. Pritchard tested it by stepping through both layers and holding the candle inside. The flame did not flicker. Good, he said. Now there is one more problem you have not thought about. The vent under snow, Marit said. Pritchard looked at her. Ada told me, Marit said. 3 weeks ago. And you have done nothing about it. I did not know what to do. This was the moment that something shifted between them. Pritchard could have left. He had taught her draft discipline, load distribution, thermal sealing, fire pacing, and the entrance baffle. He had carried a timber post across a slag field on bad knees. He owed her nothing, and his professional assessment, that the shelter would probably fail, had not changed. But she had said she did not know instead of pretending she did. In Pritchard's experience, that was rarer than competence. He walked outside and stood on the packed earth roof, looking down at the old throat opening where it emerged from the wall. Snow would cover it. Drifting snow would bury it. Without a vent, the smoke would back into the chamber, and Marit would either open the entrance to clear the air, losing all her stored heat, or she would suffocate. 2 things, Pritchard said when he came back inside. First, you need a chimney extension, a length of stovepipe or a clay-lined channel that stands above the roof line, something tall enough that drifting snow cannot cover it. I do not have stovepipe. No, but there are pipe sections in the scrap heap behind the Harrison works, pieces too short for a full run, but long enough for an extension. I will show you which ones. And the second thing? A marker, a red cloth tied to a bent rod, driven into the roof above the vent. If snow buries the pipe, you go outside and find the red marker. The marker tells you where to dig. Without it, you dig blind in a storm and you die 3 feet from the vent. He paused. Also, you need a second air inlet, low, near the entrance, a hole the size of your fist, angled down so snow cannot drift into it, covered with a loose stone you can remove from inside. If the throat blocks, you open the low inlet and let fresh air enter at the floor. The smoke rises because it is warm. The fresh air enters low because it is cold. You keep breathing while you solve the vent problem. You have thought about this before, Marit said. I have buried men who did not think about it, Pritchard said. Not the same thing. They spent the next 2 days building the vent extension and the low inlet. Pritchard found a stovepipe section, 20 inches long, rusted but sound, in the Harrison scrap heap and carried it back across the slag field with the expression of a man performing a task beneath his dignity for reasons he chose not to explain. Marit chiseled a socket into the throat opening and seated the pipe with clay mortar. Pritchard bent a rod from a broken ore cart handle and tied a strip of red flannel to the top. They drove it into the roof dirt above the vent. The low inlet was simpler. Marit chiseled a hole through the east wall at floor level, angled downward, and set a loose flat stone over it. Inside the stone sat on a ledge. Outside, the hole opened into a drift pocket that would fill with snow but could be poked clear with the stove rod Pritchard left beside the entrance. When they finished, Pritchard stood in the center of the bay and turned a full circle. He examined the roof overhead. Saplings, cross lattice, burlap, hay, boards, earth, all pressing down with a weight he could feel in the slight bow of the center post. He examined the walls, sealed, mortared, 30 inches of refractory brick absorbing whatever the fire gave. He examined the floor. Yellow firebrick, scarred and industrial, radiating the faintest residual warmth from that morning's fires. He examined the throat, drawing clean, the vent pipe standing above the roof, the red marker visible from any direction, the double baffle entrance, the low inlet stone. He said, "I told you this would not work." "You told me I would die in a better-built ruin than you expected," Marit said. "I revised my estimate," Pritchard said. "You may only nearly die." Day 20. The freight office posted a notice. Mosquito Pass closed to wagon traffic. The Denver and Rio Grande reduced service to emergency runs. A teamster who had come over Tennessee Pass said the sky north of Leadville looked like the inside of a cannon barrel, black, heavy, and aiming downward. Marit counted her fuel. She had accumulated a pile against the inside of the north wall. Twigs bundled by thickness, brush tied with wire, coal crumbs swept from the slag road into a burlap sack, and 3 armfuls of dry kindling gifted by a miner's wife whose husband had told her to stop helping the Norwegian widow and who had helped anyway. The pile was small. Against a cabin wall with a cast iron stove, it would last 2 days, maybe 3. But she was not heating a cabin. She was feeding a floor. Early performance appeared in numbers she tracked with scratches on the wall beside her sleeping spot. Outside dawn temperature, 5 degrees above zero. Inside after 1 night with 2 small twig fires, 28 degrees. Firebrick near the fire pit, warm enough to dry a damp sock. Water cup near the wall, a skim of ice on top, not frozen solid. Smoke vent, drawing clean unless the wind struck from the northeast, in which case the throat coughed once before settling. 23 degrees of difference, not with a stove, not with 6 cords, with twigs and brick and dirt and time. Pritchard came to inspect. He pressed his palm to the floor in 6 places, held it there, moved on. He checked the center post for sag. He checked the mortar joints for cracking. He looked at Marit's fuel pile and said nothing for long enough that she knew he was calculating. "Mild cold proves nothing," he said. 5 above zero is a pleasant evening in January. A true whiteout will drive wind into every crack you missed and bury that vent pipe by morning. This has not been tested. "Then it will be tested," Marit said. "You say that as if you have a choice in the timing." He left with instructions. Keep the fire small. Keep the brick charged. Keep the vent clear. Keep the low inlet accessible. Keep the red marker tied tight. He said these things the way a surgeon says, keep the wound clean. Not as advice, but as a condition of survival. Ada Meeker asked to sleep in the brick den one night when her tar paper shack roof leaked in a sleet storm. She arrived at dusk, skeptical, carrying her bedroll, and a look that said she was doing Marit a favor by testing the shelter and not the other way around. She woke at dawn and sat up on the firebrick floor and stared at her boots. "They are not frozen," Ada said. "No. My boots are always frozen in the morning, since October." "The floor holds heat," Marit said. Ada pressed her palm to the brick. She held it there. Her face changed in a way that Marit recognized, the same shift she had felt on her own first morning, the understanding that something she had dismissed was actually happening. "Warm in a calm is not warm in a howl," Ada said, but she said it more quietly than she had said it 3 weeks before. Quaid escalated in the way that men like Quaid always escalated, not with confrontation, but with commerce. He visited Evan Pritchard at his boarding room and offered him salvage work. $4 a day to assess and stack refractory brick at the old Arkansas Valley Smelter site, where a Denver investor wanted an inventory before purchasing the ruins. The work was legitimate. The timing was not. "You want me away from the gulch," Pritchard said. I want you working, Quaid said. A man your age with bad knees should not be carrying timbers across slag heaps for a widow who cannot pay. Pritchard refused. The refusal cost him. Quaid's word carried weight among the men who hired estimators, and within a week Pritchard found that 2 jobs he had been promised were suddenly filled. He did not tell Marit about this, but she saw it in the way he arrived at the ruin with less purpose and more time. A working man does not appear at mid-morning on a Wednesday with his tool bag and nothing on his calendar. She understood then what his help was costing him. Not money. Pritchard would not have taken payment from her if she had any to give, but standing. Reputation. The professional respect that a furnace mason carried like currency in a smelter town. He was spending it on her shelter, and Quaid was making sure the price went up. You should take the salvage work, Marit said. I should do many things, Pritchard said. Today I'm going to show you how to read a crack in a mortar joint before it becomes a gap. The telegraph talk arrived on day 24 like a rumor that grew teeth. A front had dropped temperatures across Wyoming and shut the mountain roads north of the territory. Cattle froze standing in their pastures. A freight driver who had come over Fremont Pass said the sky had turned green before the wind hit, and the wind had hit like a wall falling. The phrase passed through Leadville's saloons and boarding houses and mercantiles the way all frontier disaster language passed, as a borrowed name for something too large to describe fresh. White hurricane. It was not the Great White Hurricane that would paralyze the East Coast 4 months later. It was a mining camp name for a mountain whiteout, the kind of storm that came down from the peaks with a pressure drop so sudden that stoves drew badly and eardrums ached, followed by a wind that did not gust but sustained hour after hour, driving powdered snow sideways through every crack and crevice that a building offered to the sky. The old-timers said one was coming. They said it the way they said everything, with confidence and without specification. Could be tomorrow, could be next week. Could skip Leadville entirely and bury Aspen instead. Nobody knew. Everybody prepared. Marit prepared by feeding the floor. She built small fires from dawn to dusk, 6 twigs at a time, letting each batch burn to ash before adding the next. She pressed her palm to the brick every hour. The warmth was building, not fast, not dramatically, but the radius of heated brick around the fire pit was expanding, creeping outward toward the walls like something alive and slow and patient. Pritchard came one last time before the storm. He brought a bundle of steel banding, scrap from the Harrison Works, and showed Marit how to wrap it around the center post and secure it to the wall with masonry anchors. If the roof tried to shift in the wind, the banding would hold the post in place. He also brought a clay pipe, unlit, and sat in the bay for an hour without speaking. When he stood to leave, he said, I have not changed my mind. I do not think this will work in the way you believe it will. But I have been wrong before, not often, but before. He handed her a block of hard tallow wrapped in cloth. Eat this if you must. Burn it if you have nothing else. Do not burn it and eat it on the same night. That is not a lesson. That is a choice. Marit watched him climb the slag road. His knees had worsened. He favored the left leg. He did not look back. The storm arrived wrong. It came not in the night when people expected it, when lanterns were lit and stoves were banked and doors were latched and children were stacked in bed like cordwood under quilts. It came mid-afternoon on a Tuesday after a morning so bright and windless that laundry hung outside on lines and men walked to their shifts without scarves, and a boy at the schoolhouse left his coat on the bench because the sun through the window felt like a different season. The sky changed first. The blue went white at the edges, then gray, then a yellowish brown that did not belong to any weather Marit had seen in Colorado. She was in town when it turned, walking back from the creek with a sack of clay for patching, and she felt the pressure drop in her ears before she felt the wind. A dull ache, like descending a mine shaft too quickly. Then the wind. It did not gust. It arrived at full force, sustained, driving from the northwest with a sound that was not a howl and not a roar, but something between a continuous tearing pressure, as if the air itself were being ripped apart at a seam. Powdered snow came with it, not falling, horizontal. A white wall moving across the gulch so fast that the smelter ruins disappeared before Marit could count to 5. She had one sack of twigs, a kettle, a borrowed shawl over her bodice. She was 400 yards from the brick den, and she could not see 20 feet. She lowered her head and walked into the wind. The snow hit her face like sand. It filled her eyes, packed into the folds of her shawl, drove into the gap between her collar and her neck. She walked by memory, past the slag heap, past the broken fence posts, past the place where the path bent toward the east wall gap. She counted steps because she could not count landmarks. 200 steps from the creek road to the ruin. She had counted them before, on a clear day. As a precaution, she did not think she would need this soon. At step 160, she heard something through the wind. A voice. Small. Not words. A sound. The sound a child makes when fear has passed through crying and into the silence beyond it. Tom Meager was 12 years old, Ada's younger brother, a boy who carried coal scraps from the slag road to supplement the fuel Ada could not afford to buy. He had been on the Smelter road with a burlap sack of coal dust when the storm hit, and he had done what any 12-year-old would do in a whiteout. Stopped walking, crouched, and waited for someone to come. Marit found him by sound. He was squatting against a slag pile with his arms over his head and his eyes squeezed shut, and when she grabbed his collar, he did not fight because his hands were too cold to grip anything. "The brick den," Marit said, pulling him to his feet. "Walk with me. Do not stop." 40 steps. She counted. The east wall appeared as a dark shape in the white, and she guided Tom through the entrance gap, through the double baffle, and onto the firebrick floor. Inside was dark. The vent pipe was already whistling, wind forcing air down the throat, pushing cold into the bay. Marit lit a twig fire in the pit and watched the smoke. It rose, hit the throat, and came back down. Backdraft. The wind outside was pressing harder than the draw could pull. Tom coughed. The smoke thickened. Marit killed the fire. She stamped the twigs flat and kicked ash over the embers until the last glow died. The bay went dark except for the faint gray light leaking through the entrance baffle. "Why did you put it out?" Tom asked. His voice was thin. His lips were blue. "Because the smoke cannot leave," Marit said. "And if we breathe it, we die before the cold touches us." She had to clear the vent. The vent was outside, on the roof, under a storm that was trying to erase the distinction between ground and sky. She tied the rope, a 10-foot length of hemp she had scavenged from the Harrison works, around her waist and secured the other end to the center post. She told Tom to hold the rope and not let go. She pushed through the double baffle and into the storm. The wind took her breath. She turned her back to it and gasped until her lungs filled, then turned again and felt along the east wall with both hands. The wall was already drifting, snow-packing against the base, climbing. She followed the wall north to the corner, then climbed onto the roof. 3 feet of packed earth under her hands, snow on top, packing fast. She crawled on her knees, sweeping with her right hand, searching for the vent pipe. The red marker was gone, torn loose or ripped away by the first wind gust. She could not see it. She could not see anything. The snow drove into her face, and she closed her eyes and searched by touch. Her right mitten came off. She did not feel it go. She felt the cold afterward, a sharp, bright pain that climbed from her fingertips to her wrist in seconds. She kept crawling. The vent pipe was 3 feet from the north edge of the roof. She found it by smell. Even in the wind, even through the snow, the faint scent of old smoke and warm clay rose from the pipe opening. She dug around it with the tin pan she had carried in her waistband. Snow packed. Ice crystals bit into her bare hand. She cleared the pipe mouth and jammed a broken stovepipe section, the same section Pritchard had found in the Harrison scrap heap, upright into the opening, extending it 8 inches above the current snow line. It would drift over again. She knew that, but it would take time, and time was what the brick gave her. She crawled back to the edge, slid down the wall, and pushed through the baffle with her bare hand tucked against her stomach. Inside, she fell onto the firebrick floor and stayed there, breathing for 30 seconds. Tom had not let go of the rope. Marit built a new fire, 6 twigs, thumb-sized, arranged in a loose cross on the firebrick. She lit them and watched the smoke. It rose. It curled against the ceiling. It found the throat. It hesitated. Then it drew. The cleared vent pulled the smoke up and out, and the bay's air thinned and cleared. Marit added 6 more twigs. The flame was small, nearly invisible, but the heat went down into the firebrick floor the way Pritchard had promised it would, slowly, steadily, without waste. The brick was cold. Days of charging had given the floor a base warmth, but the open entrance during the storm had cost degrees. Marit felt the floor with her good hand. Cool, not cold, not warm. The memory of warmth fading. She fed the fire again and again. 6 twigs. Wait. 6 twigs. Wait. The floor began to answer. The first person arrived 40 minutes into the storm, a woman named Clara Ide, 38, a miner's wife from the cabin row near the slag road. She came through the entrance baffle carrying a bedroll and weeping without sound. Her cabin roof had lost 3 shingles in the first gust. Then a sheet of tar paper tore free and sailed into the white. Her husband was at the mine. She had 2 choices: stay in a cabin with a hole in the roof and a stove that could not draw, or run for the only structure she knew that sat below the wind. Marit pulled her in. Clara dropped onto the firebrick floor and pressed her palms flat against the brick and said, "It is warm." "It is not warm," Marit said. "It is less cold." "Less cold is warm enough," Clara said. The second arrival came an hour later. Ada Meeker, with a cut on her scalp from a piece of flying roofing tin, furious and frightened and cursing the wind in terms that made Tom cover his ears. Her tar paper shack had lost its entire roof. Not pieces, the entire roof. She had watched it peel upward, like the lid of a can, and disappear east. Ada sat against the north wall and held a rag to her scalp and looked at the packed earth ceiling above her head. The ceiling that she had called a foolish idea. The ceiling that was not moving, was not rattling, was not tearing, was not doing anything at all except sitting there dense and dark and heavy, while the wind outside screamed across its surface like water across a stone. "Do not say it," Ada said. "I was not going to say anything," Marit said. "You were thinking it." "I am thinking about the vent pipe. The wind will bury it again in an hour. If you are still watching, if you need to know whether this shelter holds or whether the smoke and the snow and the cold wind, subscribe now and stay, because the next hour inside these brick walls decides everything." The crisis deepened in waves, and each wave carried a question the last one had not asked. The first wave was wind. The sustained gale drove snow against the east wall and built a drift that climbed past the entrance gap within 2 hours. The double baffle held, but cold air pushed through the fabric in a steady, thin stream that pooled along the floor and pushed the warm air upward toward the ceiling where the throat took it. Marit noticed the temperature dropping near the floor and understood why. The warm air was being stolen from above while cold air replaced it from below. She needed the low inlet. Not to let air in, the storm was forcing air through every remaining gap, but to control where it entered. She pulled the loose stone from the east wall hole and felt outside air pour through at floor level, steady and directed. The incoming cold air now entered in one stream, pushed toward the fire, warmed as it passed the heated brick, rose, and exited through the throat. The random leaking stopped. The circulation had a path. The temperature near the floor stabilized. Then it began to climb. Marit tracked it the only way she could, by touch. The brick near the fire pit was warm enough to press against without flinching. The brick at arm's length was cool, but not cold. The brick at the wall was cold, but the mortar joints were not frosted, which meant the interior surface was holding above freezing. The second wave was fuel. 2 hours in, Marit counted what remained. The twig bundles she had carried from town, 11. The coal crumb sack, half full. The kindling from the miner's wife, gone, used in the morning fires. The scrap wood, 3 pieces, saved for emergency. 5 people were breathing in a 12 by 16 room: Tom, Clara, Ada, and Marit. The 5th arrived at dusk. Reuben Stoll was Quade's hired hauler, the same man who had stood behind Quade in the smelter yard 3 weeks before, while Quade offered Marit $3 for her right to squat. Stoll was 36, broad, silent, in the way that men who work for louder men become silent. He had been crossing from a damaged bunkhouse to the mercantile when the wind caught him on the open slag road. He staggered, fell, crawled, and collapsed against the smelter's east wall. Marit heard the thud, only because the wind lulled for 3 seconds. A brief pocket of relative silence, the storm catching its breath. She pushed through the baffle and found Stoll slumped against the brick, snow already building against his shoulders. His face was white except for the red patches on his cheeks where frostbite had begun its work. He was conscious but not coherent. She dragged him inside. It took Ada's help and most of Marit's remaining strength. Stoll weighed nearly twice what she did. They pulled him through the baffle and onto the firebrick floor, and he lay there with his eyes open and his body shaking in the long, deep tremors that meant his core was losing heat faster than his muscles could generate it. Marit gave him the warm spot. She moved him next to the fire pit, turned his body so his back pressed against the heated brick, and wrapped both her remaining blankets around him. She fed the fire. 6 twigs, and watched the heat crawl from the brick into his clothes. "He works for Quade," Ada said. "He is a man on a cold floor," Marit said. The 3rd wave was Pritchard. He arrived after full dark, which meant he had walked through the storm for at least an hour. He came through the baffle, dragging something, a burlap sack of coal, actual coal, not crumbs, that he had taken from the Harrison Works outdoor pile. His beard was frozen into a solid mass of ice. His right hand, the one that gripped the sack, was white at the fingertips. Frostbite. He dropped the coal beside the fire pit and sat down and did not speak for 5 minutes. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "The Harrison bunkhouse lost its stovepipe. Wind bent it flat. 12 men in a room with no draw and no heat." He looked at the ceiling, the walls, the tiny fire. "I told them to seal the windows and burn furniture. I do not know if they listened." He looked at the floor. He pressed his good hand to the fire brick beside the pit. "The floor's warm," he said. "The floor has been warm for 3 days," Marit said. "I have been feeding it the way you told me." Pritchard stared at his frost-bitten hand. "I believed you would keep the frost out for a night. Perhaps two. I did not believe the mass would charge this far." He pressed his palm to the floor again, farther from the pit. Still warm. "The brick is not merely holding heat," he said. "It is giving back yesterday's fires, and the day before that. 6 people now, 12 by 16 feet. The air should have been suffocating, but the throat drew steadily, and the low inlet provided fresh air at floor level, and the packed earth ceiling did not sweat or drip, because the temperature differential between interior and exterior was managed by the mass, not by the air. The walls and floor absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, preventing the rapid swings that caused condensation in wooden buildings. Marit fed the coal sparingly. A single chunk, split with the broken shovel into pieces the size of her thumb, produced more sustained heat than a fistful of twigs. She placed each piece on the brick floor beside the dying twig fire and let it catch slowly. The coal burned low and hot, close to the surface, and the brick drank it. Outside, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero. Inside, the floor near the fire held at 36 degrees. The floor near the walls held at 30. The air at chest height held at 32. At floor level, where bodies lay on fire brick, 36. Clara stopped shivering. Tom fell asleep. Reuben Stoll's tremors subsided, and he turned onto his side and breathed slowly. Ada sat with her knees drawn up and her back against the north wall and said, "I slept here once and told you warm in a calm was not warm in a howl." "You were right to say it," Marit said. "I was wrong about what you were building," Ada said. The fourth wave came at midnight, and it was not cold. It was earth. The entrance drift sealed them in. Snow packed against the east wall filled the gap, pressed through the baffle, and formed a solid wall of compressed powder where the exit had been. The wind had driven the drift above the wall line. There was no exit. Tom woke and saw the sealed entrance. He did not scream. He sat up and stared at it with the fixed expression of a child who has passed through fear into the still, bright place beyond it. Ada saw his face and crossed the bay and pressed her hand over his eyes. Then she turned to the sealed entrance and began to claw at the packed snow with her hands. "Stop," Pritchard said. His voice was quiet. He could not stand. His knees had locked during the hours on the floor, and his frost-bitten hand was swelling. But his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years in enclosed spaces where panic killed faster than the thing people panicked about. "If you open the entrance, you lose the heat in the room in minutes," Pritchard said. "The wind will pour through and strip the warmth from the brick in an hour. We do not need the entrance. We need air." He pointed at the low inlet. "Clear the outside end from inside." Marit picked up the stove rod, a 3-foot iron bar Pritchard had left beside the entrance weeks ago. She pulled the loose stone from the inlet hole and pushed the rod through. It hit packed snow. She pushed harder. The rod slid through 8 inches of drift and broke into open air. Cold air poured through the hole, sharp, clean, bitter, and breathable. She replaced the stone halfway, leaving a gap the width of 3 fingers. Fresh air entered in a thin, steady stream. The throat continued to draw smoke upward. The circulation held. They were sealed in, but they could breathe. The fire could draw. The brick continued to radiate. The packed earth roof above them held the weight of the storm without shifting, without cracking, without doing anything except being heavy and still, and exactly where Marit had placed it. The temperature inside held at 34 degrees near the floor. Outside, it dropped to 22 below zero. Marit fed the fire. 6 twigs. Wait. A coal chip. Wait. She broke fuel into thumb-length pieces and placed them one at a time, measuring each addition by the warmth it produced in the brick beneath. Her bare hand, the one that had lost its mitten on the roof, was swollen and red but not frostbitten. The brick had kept it warm enough between feedings. Pritchard, sitting against the north wall with his injured hand wrapped in Ada's scarf, watched Marit work. He watched the way she measured fuel by touch, the way she pressed her palm to the floor between fires, the way she waited for the brick to cool before adding heat. She was doing exactly what he had taught her. She was feeding the floor the way you feed a sick animal, small and steady, not all at once. "Your father was a mason," Pritchard said. "A baker," Marit said. "Same trade," Pritchard said. "Different product." Dawn did not arrive as light. It arrived as silence. The wind did not stop gradually. It stopped the way a held breath stops, all at once, with a pressure change that made eardrums ache in the other direction. The storm had passed. The cold remained, deep and still, but the wind was gone. Marit took the stove rod and opened the low inlet fully. Fresh air poured across the floor, cold enough to sting, but the brick held its warmth against the intrusion. The floor was still warm. The walls were still above freezing. The coal sack was 1/3 empty. The twig bundles numbered 5. She had fuel for another 2 days at this rate. The storm had lasted 14 hours. She had used less fuel in 14 hours with 6 people than a cast iron stove consumed in 3 hours with 1. Marit and Ada dug through the entrance drift from inside, pushing snow into the bay and packing it against the east wall. It took an hour. When the outer baffle opened to daylight, the cold air hit Marit's face and she closed her eyes and breathed. Tom Meeker stood beside her, looking out at a world buried in white. The smelter roof was a smooth mound. The slag heaps were soft hills. The cabin row near the road was a line of broken shapes, roofs peeled, stovepipes bent, tar paper stripped and scattered downwind like dead leaves. One cabin had its roof entirely gone. That was Ada's. Reuben Stoll walked out on his own feet, unsteady but alive. He stood in the smelter yard and looked back at the earth mound and the brick walls, and the thin line of smoke still rising from the vent pipe, and said nothing. He was a man who worked for Quaid. He did not have words for what had just happened, but he was standing in the snow instead of lying under it, and he knew why. Pritchard came out last. He leaned against the east wall and held his frost-bitten hand against his chest and looked at the white mound that had been Marit's roof and was now Marit's proof. "I told her a furnace needed tons of fuel," he said, to no one in particular. "I forgot the furnace had already been built." The morning after the storm, Leadville counted what it had lost. 3 roofs gone entirely. Ada's tar paper shack, a bunkhouse behind the Harrison Works, and a miner's cabin on the South Slag Road whose owner had nailed the shingles with half-inch tacks instead of proper roofing nails. 7 roofs damaged badly enough that families slept elsewhere. 14 stovepipes bent, cracked, or torn loose. 1 man dead, a Swedish ore hauler named Lindqvist, who had tried to walk from the Matchless mine to his cabin on Carbonate Hill and was found sitting against a fence post the next morning with his hands in his pockets and his eyes open. Nobody blamed the storm for Lindqvist. They blamed Lindqvist for Lindqvist. He had walked when he should have stayed. That was the frontier's arithmetic. Death was a calculation error, not a tragedy. And the living moved on because standing still cost calories they could not spare. Marit's shelter had burned less than 1 bushel of twigs and coal crumbs in 14 hours. Ada's shack had lost its roof. The bunkhouse, where Reuben Stoll had been sleeping before the wind drove him out, was uninhabitable. Its stovepipe was bent flat, its windows were broken, and 6 inches of snow covered the floor. The brick den had held above freezing near the floor after the first 2 hours, and never dropped below 30 degrees at the coldest point along the east wall. Melt water in Merritt's tin cup had stayed liquid through the night. Pails of water in wooden cabins froze solid by midnight. These numbers traveled through Leadville the way all numbers traveled through mining towns, on the feet of men who understood tonnage and yield and efficiency, and who recognized in the difference between a frozen pail and a liquid cup a ratio that mattered. Pritchard's validation came 3 days after the storm at Bell's Mercantile, where men gathered around the stove in the mornings to drink coffee and discuss who had lost what and who was to blame. Pritchard walked in with his right hand bandaged, 2 fingertips blackened, the rest swollen, the hand of a man who would never again do fine chisel work. He ordered coffee. He stood near the stove, but not too close, because a man with frostbite knows that sudden warmth is as dangerous as the cold that caused it. Silas Bell, who owned the Mercantile and had opinions about everything that happened within a mile of his counter, said, "Pritchard, you spent the blizzard in the widow's furnace grave. What is your professional assessment?" The room went quiet. 8 men, 2 women, and a boy who was supposed to be sweeping. Pritchard was known. His word about masonry and heat and brick carried weight not because he demanded it, but because 40 years of being right about furnace construction had made his opinions into something resembling facts. Pritchard set his coffee down. He looked at his bandaged hand. "I told Marit Brieke that a furnace keeps heat only when men feed it by the ton," he said. "I told her she had twigs. I told her she would die in a better-built ruin than I expected." He picked up his coffee with his left hand. The room waited. "I forgot that the furnace had already been built," he said. 30-inch refractory walls, 4-inch firebrick floor, a draft channel designed for smelter temperatures. She did not build a furnace. She inherited one. What she built was a lid, and the lid held. He drank his coffee. "I was right about one thing," he said. "The danger was real. If the vent had blocked and stayed blocked, the smoke would have killed us. If the entrance had stayed sealed and the low inlet had failed, we would have suffocated. If the roof had collapsed under the snow load, we would have been buried. Every warning I gave her was a real warning, but she solved every one of them before the storm arrived. Except the mitten. She lost a mitten." A man near the back, a timberman from the Morning Star, said, "How much fuel did she burn?" "Less than a bushel," Pritchard said. "Twigs and coal crumbs, 14 hours, 6 people, less than a bushel." The room processed this. In a town where firewood sold for $12 a cord and a cast iron stove consumed 4 to 6 cords in a winter, the number was not merely interesting, it was a provocation. "That is not possible," the timberman said. "The brick holds heat the way a lake holds water," Pritchard said. "You do not fill a lake with a hose. You let rain fill it over days, and then the lake has water whether or not it rains." She spent 3 weeks warming that floor with small fires. When the storm came, the floor had 3 weeks of heat stored in it. She drew on the savings. A stove has no savings. A stove is hand to mouth. You stop feeding it and the room goes cold in an hour. He finished his coffee and left. At the door he turned. "The woman knew what she was doing," he said. "I am the one who had to be taught." This was Evan Pritchard's conversion, and it carried weight because it cost him something. He was not a man who admitted error easily. His professional pride was the last thing he would surrender, and he surrendered it in public, in front of men whose respect he needed for his livelihood. He did not do it for Marit. He did it because it was accurate, and Pritchard was, above all things, a man who could not abide an inaccurate assessment standing uncorrected. Ada Meeker's conversion was quieter and more practical. She came to the brick den the morning after Pritchard's speech at Bell's and sat on the firebrick floor and said, "Teach me." "Teach you what?" "Everything. My shack is gone. I have a wash tub, 3 shirts that are not mine, and a temper. If I rebuild with tar paper, the next wind takes it. If I build with brick and dirt, maybe I have a roof in March." Merritt did not lecture. She showed. She walked Ada through the bay, touching each element: wall, mortar joint, fire pit, vent throat, low inlet, center post, roof layers, and explaining not how it worked, but why it worked. The difference was important. How was a recipe? Why was a principle? A recipe could be followed incorrectly. A principle, once understood, could be adapted. "The brick holds heat because it is dense," Merritt said, pressing Ada's hand to the firebrick floor. "Dense things change temperature slowly. Air is not dense, so air changes temperature quickly. A stove heats air, and the air escapes. This floor heats brick, and the brick stays." "How long does it stay?" "Depends on the mass. This floor is 4 inches of firebrick over rubble. The walls are 30 inches. The more mass, the longer it holds. But the more mass, the longer it takes to charge." "So you cannot build one and be warm tomorrow." "No. You build one and feed it for a week and be warm on the 8th day." Ada stared at the floor. She was doing the math that every practical person did when confronted with a new method, measuring the investment against the return, weighing the labor against the alternative, calculating whether she had enough time and enough material and enough stubbornness to see it through. "My shack has a cellar pit," Ada said. 2 feet deep, stone-lined. The stones are river rock, not fire brick, but they are thick. "River rock holds heat," Merritt said. "Not as well as fire brick, but better than air." "If I bank the cellar walls with slag brick and sod," Ada said, "and cover it with a dirt roof on poles and seal the cracks." "You have a shelter," Merritt said. "Smaller, colder, but a shelter." "How thick does the roof dirt need to be?" 2 feet minimum. 3 is better. More than 3, you need bigger timbers." Ada stood up. "I need to find poles." She left. Merritt watched her walk toward the creek bottom with the pace of a woman who had stopped asking whether something was possible and started asking how long it would take. The community came in 1s and 2s over the following week, each carrying a specific question shaped by a specific problem. A miner's wife named Clara Edie, the same Clara who had sheltered in the brick den during the storm, returned with a piece of charcoal and a plank. She wanted to know the proportions, how thick the walls, how small the room, where the vent goes, how big the fire should be. Merritt drew it for her on the plank, a rectangle 12 by 16, walls marked with hash lines for thickness, a circle for the fire pit, an arrow for the throat, a small square for the low inlet. Pritchard, sitting on a crate with his bandaged hand in his lap, corrected the vent angle. A school teacher named Graves asked whether a cellar wall could work the same way. Merritt said yes, if the wall was stone or brick and the ceiling was sealed. Graves said the schoolhouse had a crawlspace cellar with stone walls 2 feet thick. If he sealed the floor above and cut a vent, would the cellar hold heat? Merritt said she did not know, but the physics did not change because the building was different. Dense walls absorb heat. Sealed spaces hold air. Vents remove smoke. The principles applied whether the structure was a smelter ruin or a schoolhouse basement. A teamster wanted to know about smoke. His wife had nearly died in a cabin with a blocked stovepipe 2 winters before, and the word suffocation carried more weight in his household than the word cold. Merritt showed him the candle test, the same test Pritchard had taught her. Hold the flame near the vent. If it pulls toward the vent, the draft draws. If it stands still, the air is dead. If it pushes away, you are breathing your own fire, and you must open air immediately. The teamster practiced the candle test 3 times before he was satisfied. Marit did not charge for this knowledge. She did not hoard it. She stood in Bell's Mercantile on a Saturday morning and drew diagrams in ash on the plank floor. Small room, thick walls, low inlet, high vent, sealed cracks, small fires, and answered every question until the ash wore smooth and she had to redraw. Pritchard watched from his crate. When someone asked about mortar composition, he answered. When someone asked about load distribution, he answered. When someone asked about fire pacing, he looked at Marit and said, "Ask her." She taught the brick to remember. They were collaborating now, not mentor and student. 2 people with different knowledge working the same problem. Pritchard knew masonry, how brick was laid, how mortar failed, how load traveled through walls, how draft physics worked in industrial chimneys. Marit knew heat, how it moved through mass, how it was wasted, how it could be harvested from small fires and stored in dense material for slow release. Together they could answer questions that neither could answer alone. The first adoption happened that week. Ada and Marit banked Ada's cellar pit with slag brick and river rock, sealed the gaps with Pritchard's mortar, laid a pole-and-sod roof over the pit, cut a vent through the south wall, and built a fire pit the size of a dinner plate. Pritchard could not do the heavy work. His hand was bandaged and his knees were worse, but he supervised from a stool, correcting angles, checking plumb, tapping mortar joints with his good hand. Ada's cellar shelter was crude compared to the brick den. The walls were thinner, the roof was lower, the vent was narrower. But on the first night, with a small fire burning on the stone floor, the temperature inside held at 26 degrees when the temperature outside dropped to 4. Ada slept without her boots for the first time since October. Pritchard built vent markers for both shelters, red cloth on bent iron rods, standing 2 feet above the roof line. He showed Tom Meeker how to make them and told him to build one for every shelter in the camp that had a vent pipe. Tom, who had spent 14 hours on the firebrick floor during the storm, listening to the wind try to tear the world apart, did not need to be told twice. Quade's response to Marit's validation was neither gracious nor direct. It was commercial. Within a week of the storm, he began visiting the damaged bunkhouses and cabins on the east side of town, talking to men whose roofs had failed, whose stovepipes had bent, whose families had spent the blizzard huddled in schoolrooms and saloons. He did not mention Marit by name. He mentioned brick. "Firebrick is what you need," he told a miner whose wife had carried their baby through the storm to the Methodist church. "Firebrick walls, thick as a furnace. That is what kept people alive in the gulch." The miner asked where to get firebrick. "I have a supply," Quade said, "salvaged from the old Arkansas Valley Works. Good brick, sound brick. I can deliver a wagon load for $18. $18 for a wagon load of brick that Quade had acquired for nothing from an abandoned smelter. Brick that was ordinary construction material, not the high-density refractory fire clay that lined furnaces and held heat. The distinction mattered. Refractory fire brick was dense, heavy, and designed to absorb extreme temperatures. Common building brick was porous, lighter, and shed heat faster. But the men Quade was selling to did not know the difference, and Quade did not explain it. Marit learned about the sales from Clara Eady, who had heard her husband discussing a purchase with a shift partner. "He is selling building brick as fire brick," Marit said to Pritchard. "I know," Pritchard said. "I saw the load. Welsh common brick, not Stourbridge pattern, half the density. a quarter the heat capacity. Will it work? It will work better than wood and worse than what you have. The people who buy it will build shelters that are warmer than cabins but colder than yours, and they will blame the method instead of the material. Can you tell them? Pritchard looked at his bandaged hand. I can tell them. Whether they listen depends on whether they trust a crippled mason more than a man offering to sell them safety. This was the tension that would carry through the next months. Marit's method was sound, but Quade's imitation was cheaper, faster, and wrong. The principle worked. The product did not. And the people who needed help most, the poorest, the most desperate, the ones who could not afford to wait for good materials or build slowly, were the ones most likely to buy Quade's brick and build badly. Pritchard's hand worsened through December. The frostbitten fingertips did not recover. A doctor in town, a man who treated mine injuries with laudanum and optimism in roughly equal measure, told Pritchard he would lose the 2 blackened fingers and possibly a third. Pritchard refused amputation for 3 weeks. He wrapped the hand and kept working, one-handed, teaching Merritt to read brick cracks by tapping with a hammer and listening to the ring. A sound brick rings clean, he said, holding a refractory block against the wall while Merritt tapped it with the chisel. A cracked brick gives a dull sound. A brick with internal fractures sounds hollow. You hear the difference? Merritt tapped 3 bricks. The first rang. The second thudded. The third was somewhere between. The second one is cracked, she said. And the third? Settling. Not cracked yet, but it will crack if load increases. Pritchard looked at her. How do you know that? Because that is the sound the bread oven made in Kavitaseed the year before my father repaired it. He said the oven was complaining, not broken. Pritchard laughed. It was the first time Merritt had heard him laugh. The sound was rusty, like a hinge that had not been used in years. Your father understood brick better than half the masons I have worked with, Pritchard said, and he did it with rye dough instead of mortar. Their relationship had shifted. The early days had been instruction, Pritchard teaching, Merritt learning, the hierarchy clear. After the storm, the hierarchy dissolved. Pritchard knew industrial-scale masonry. Merritt knew domestic-scale heat management. He could build a furnace. She could keep a family alive inside one. They needed each other's knowledge, and the need made them equals in the way that shared labor makes people equal, not through declaration, but through the daily evidence that neither could do the other's work. They disagreed about the vent design. Pritchard wanted a taller chimney extension, a 3-foot clay-lined pipe that would stand above any plausible drift. Merritt wanted a shorter pipe with a wider mouth, arguing that the wider opening would draw better in cross winds. They argued for 2 days. Merritt built both designs on opposite sides of the roof and tested them in a windstorm. Pritchard's tall pipe drew better in still air. Merritt's wide pipe drew better in wind. They compromised. A 2-foot pipe with a flared opening and a clay hood to deflect direct downdraft. The disagreement mattered because it proved the relationship was real. A mentor who is never challenged teaches obedience, not knowledge. A student who never pushes back learns procedure, not principle. Merritt and Pritchard pushed each other because they respected each other's competence, and the pushing made the designs better. But Pritchard's hand was not getting better. In January, he lost the 2 blackened fingers. The doctor cut them in a back room at the boarding house, while Pritchard bit a leather strap, and Ada held a lantern, and Merritt waited outside in the cold because she could not bear the sound. When it was done, Pritchard walked out with his hand wrapped in cotton and linen and said, I can still hold a plumb bob. I cannot hold a chisel. The difference is that a plumb bob tells the truth, and a chisel makes it. I am done making. He continued to teach. Through January and February, he came to the brick den almost daily, sitting on his crate, supervising repairs, answering questions from the growing number of people who came to look at Marit's shelter and ask how to build their own. But his body was failing in the way that bodies fail at 56 with bad knees, missing fingers, and a career of heavy labor, not suddenly but steadily. Each day slightly worse than the one before, each task slightly harder than the same task had been a week ago. Marit watched him deteriorate the way she watched a mortar joint develop a crack. Slowly, with the knowledge that no intervention could stop the process. Only slow it. In late February, a letter arrived from Pueblo. Pritchard's niece, a woman named Gwen, had married a man who owned a small foundry south of the Arkansas River. She offered Pritchard a room and work as a furnace estimator, inspecting brickwork, assessing repairs, writing specifications, desk work, indoor work, work that did not require hands that could hold a chisel. Pritchard showed Marit the letter on a cold morning in the brick den. The fire was burning. 6 twigs, thumb length, barely visible against the yellow floor. The walls were warm. The air smelled of clay and old smoke, and the particular mineral scent that heated refractory brick releases when it has been charged for months. "You should go," Marit said. "I know. You do not want to go. I want to be useful. Here I am useful. In Pueblo, I will be employed. These are not the same thing." They sat in silence. The fire crackled. The throat drew. Outside, snow crossed the gulch in sheets, but inside the brick den, the air was still and warm enough that neither of them wore gloves. Pritchard left in March of 1889 on the first freight wagon over Mosquito Pass after the road opened. Before he left, he gave Marit his plumb bob, a brass weight on a cotton line blackened with use, heavy in the hand. "Do not trust a wall because it has stood," he said. "Trust it after it answers." Marit held the plumb bob and watched the wagon carry him up the pass road until the canvas top disappeared into the trees. She stood in the smelter yard with the wind on her face and the brass weight in her palm, and understood that she was alone now in the way that matters. Not without people, but without the person who had taught her how to think about what she was building. She went inside. She pressed her palm to the firebrick floor. It was warm. The brick held what it had been given, and Pritchard's lessons were in the walls and the vent and the mortar joints and the low inlet and the center post and the roof that had not sagged and the throat that drew clean and the fire that burned small. He was gone. His knowledge stayed. Spring came to Leadville the way spring comes to any place above 10,000 feet, not as warmth, but as the absence of the worst cold. The snow retreated from south-facing slopes and lingered everywhere else. The creek thawed, flooded, and carved new channels through the slag fields. The mud was worse than the ice because mud took effort without offering traction, and a town built on mining refuse turned to a landscape of gray paste that sucked at boots and wagon wheels and the foundations of every structure that sat near running water. The secondary crisis arrived in April, and it had nothing to do with cold. A spring thaw flood undermined 3 dugout-style shelters near the creek, shelters that 2 families had built after the blizzard, following versions of Marit's method they had learned secondhand. The creek rose 18 inches in 2 days, and the water found the path of least resistance, through the earth floors, up through the rubble foundations, into the sleeping spaces where families had stored food and bedding, and the accumulated evidence of 3 months of careful heat management. Marit heard about the flooding from Tom Meager, who arrived at the brick den at dawn with mud on his boots and panic in his voice. The Hirsch family's dugout is full of water, 3 inches and rising. The baby's crib is on the floor. Marit grabbed her tools. the broken shovel, the stove rod, the plumb bob, and ran. The Hirsch dugout was a pit shelter dug into the creek bank, lined with river rock, roofed with poles and sod. It had worked well through the winter. The stone walls held heat, the sod roof insulated, the fire pit kept the interior warm. But the family had built it at creek level because that was where flat ground existed, and nobody had told them, because nobody had known to tell them, because Marit herself had not thought about it until this moment, that a heat-retaining shelter built below the flood line was a bathtub waiting to be filled. The water was cold, not freezing, spring runoff carrying snowmelt from the upper gulch, but cold enough that the baby, a girl of 7 months, was crying in a way that sounded less like discomfort and more like the beginning of something dangerous. Anna Hirsch held the baby above the water and looked at Marit with the expression of a woman who had trusted a method and now stood in the method's failure. "Get out," Marit said. "Now. All of you. Take what you can carry." "The walls hold heat," Anna said. "If we pump the water, the walls hold cold water against you instead of warm air around you. Get out." The Hirsch family came out. So did the Olsen family from the dugout 30 yards downstream, where water had not yet entered, but the floor was dark with seepage. Marit walked both sites and saw the same error in both. Good walls, good roofs, good vents, bad location. The shelters worked as thermal structures. They failed as buildings because a building must be above the water that wants to destroy it. She thought of Pritchard. He would have seen this immediately. A furnace mason knew about site drainage because a smelter with water in its foundations cracked its hearth in the first firing. Marit had not known it because her father's bakery had sat on a hillside in Norway where water ran away from the building instead of toward it. She had not taught what she did not know, and people had built accordingly. Marit spent 3 days helping the Hirsch and Olsen families relocate their shelters to higher ground above the flood line. She chose the sites herself, walking the slope with the plumb bob, testing the grade, watching where water pooled after rain. She insisted on trenches, drainage cuts uphill of the shelters that diverted runoff before it reached the walls. She insisted on raised floors, firebrick or flat stone set 4 inches above the earth, creating an air gap that kept moisture from wicking into sleeping spaces. These were not things she had learned from Pritchard. These were things she learned from the flood, applied with the principles Pritchard had given her. Site selection, drainage, floor elevation. The mentor's lessons extended beyond the specific to the general lie, not just how to build a thermal shelter, but how to think about what a shelter needed to survive. 2 families accused her of overstepping. A man named Olsen told her she had no right to tell people where to build. Marit said she had no right, and she was telling them anyway, because a dead baby on a wet floor was a worse outcome than a bruised pride on a dry hillside. Olsen built where she pointed. The flood crisis revealed something Marit had not anticipated. The method could be copied, but the thinking behind it could not be transmitted in a diagram drawn in ash on a mercantile floor. People needed to understand why a shelter worked, not just how to build one. They needed to understand drainage, site selection, moisture control, vent safety, fuel management, and the dozen other variables that turned a brick and dirt box into a living space. She could not teach all of that in a Saturday morning demonstration. She needed time, and people needed patience. And neither commodity was abundant in a mining camp where the next shift started in an hour, and the next storm started whenever it pleased. If the story reminds you that real knowledge is not just knowing what to build, but understanding why it works, if you know someone who needs to hear that preparation means thinking, not just hammering, share this with them. Because what Marit Brecke learned from a flooded dugout changed everything about how she taught from that day forward. Quade's imitation brick found its first real failure in May. A family named Hart, a miner, his wife, and 3 children under 10 had bought a wagon load of Quade's salvaged brick and built a cellar shelter on the west side of town. They followed the basic design: thick walls, dirt roof, fire pit, vent. But the brick was common Welsh construction material, not refractory fire clay. The walls were 18 inches instead of 30. The vent was a single narrow pipe with no low inlet, and the fire pit was too large. The family burned arm-thick logs instead of thumb-sized twigs because nobody had told them that fire size mattered. During a cold snap in late May, the kind of late-season freeze that caught towns off guard because they had already started thinking about summer, the heart shelter filled with smoke. The narrow vent could not handle the volume from a large fire. The common brick, less dense than refractory fire clay, heated quickly on the surface, but did not store heat deeply, so the family kept the fire burning constantly instead of banking and waiting. The smoke backed up, the vent iced over. The single pipe design offered no alternative air path. Nobody died. The hard children were coughing, and the youngest had red-rimmed eyes that took a week to clear, but they survived because the miner smashed through the entrance when the smoke thickened and carried his family into the cold. They spent the night at a neighbor's cabin, shivering, and in the morning the miner walked to Bell's Mercantile and asked who had taught the Norwegian widow how to build shelters that worked, because the one he had bought from Quade nearly killed his children. The answer arrived at the Mercantile the same afternoon, in the form of Merritt Breka carrying a refractory firebrick in one hand and one of Quade's common bricks in the other. She set both bricks on the counter. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She placed her hand on the refractory brick and said, "This is what I built with. Dense, heavy, made for furnace heat, holds warmth for hours after the fire dies." She placed her hand on the common brick. "This is what was sold to the Hard family. Lighter, porous, made for building walls, not holding heat. It warms fast and cools fast. If you build with this, you must keep the fire burning all day. If you keep the fire burning all day, you need a vent that can handle the smoke all day. A single narrow pipe cannot." She picked up both bricks and held them at arm's length. The weight difference was visible in her arms. The refractory brick pulled her shoulder down. The common brick sat level. "The method works," Marit said. "The material matters. If you build with the wrong brick, you get the wrong result, and the wrong result fills your children's lungs with smoke." Pritchard's old plum bob hung from her belt. She had not planned that as a symbol. She had carried it because she had been checking a mortar joint on the way to the Mercantile. But the men in the room saw it, the tool of a mason, hanging from the belt of a woman who had earned the right to carry it, and the image settled into the story the town would tell about this moment for years afterward. Quade was not in the room. He did not need to be. The men who had bought his brick were in the room, and they were looking at the weight difference in Merritt's hands and doing the same calculation she had done, the calculation that showed that a cheap product sold as a good one could turn a safe design into a trap. The week after the Hard incident, Quade came to the smelter yard. He came alone this time. No hauler, no clerk. Just a man in a coat that had once been expensive, standing in the gap where the east wall had been and looking at the shelter that had started as an insult and become an institution. Marit was inside, repairing a mortar joint near the vent throat. She heard his boots on the fire brick and knew who it was before she turned. "The Hard family's talking to a lawyer," Quade said. "I know. They are talking about suing me for selling them brick that was not what I said it was." "I know that too." Quade stood in the doorway and looked at the interior. The fire pit with its ring of fire brick, the walls sealed smooth, the packed earth ceiling that had held through 2 more storms since the first blizzard, the vent throat drawing a thin line of smoke into the cold air. He looked at the plum bob hanging from Marit's belt. "That was Pritchard's," Quade said. It is mine now. Quaid was quiet for a long time. He was not a man who experienced shame in the way that decent people experience shame, as a corrective, a signal that behavior must change. He experienced it as a cost. Shame was an expense, and Quaid calculated expenses the way he calculated everything else against profit. The profit had turned negative. The Hart lawyer, the public demonstration at Bell's, the men who had bought his brick returning to demand refunds, the quiet word spreading through the camp that Quaid's brick was not Brecca's brick, and the difference mattered in the lungs of children. I will sign over the Smelter claim, Quaid said. The remaining brick, the foundation, the yard, all of it, to the town relief committee. Why? Because I'm done with it, and because the alternative costs more. This was not conversion. This was arithmetic. Quaid was not becoming good. He was becoming cheaper to maintain, and the cheapest position was surrender. Take your furnace grave, then, Quaid said. It was never a grave, Marit said. Quaid adjusted his hat and walked out through the east wall gap. His boots crunched on slag. The sound faded. Marit stood in the shelter she had built with twigs and dirt and stolen time and the lessons of a Welsh mason and a Norwegian baker, and she held the plumb bob in her hand and felt its weight. The brass was warm. She had been standing near the fire. The smelter yard changed in the months after Quaid signed the claim over to the relief committee. Not dramatically, Leadville did not have the money or the patience for dramatic change, but steadily, the way the firebrick floor changed temperature, slowly, measurably, and in one direction. Marit and Ada cleared the second bay. The larger space, roughly 18 by 22 feet, had lost 6 courses of brick on the east wall and had no furnace throat. It was colder, more exposed, and harder to seal than the north bay, but it had thick walls on 3 sides, a firebrick floor, and enough remaining mass to hold heat if the gaps were closed. They closed them. Over 4 weeks in May and June of 1889, Marit and Ada rebuilt the east wall to 5 feet, using salvaged refractory brick from the furnace throat's collapsed upper section and common rubble to fill the core. Marit mixed Pritchard's mortar, clay, ash, crushed firebrick dust, horsehair, and packed every joint by hand. Ada carried brick. Tom Meeker, who had turned 13 in April and grown 2 inches since the blizzard, carried dirt. The second bay did not get a furnace throat. It got a clay-lined chimney built from stacked firebrick, angled at 15 degrees through the south wall, with a flared opening and a clay hood at the top. Marit designed it using the compromise she and Pritchard had argued over, short enough to avoid excessive draft and calm air, wide enough to draw in cross wind, hooded to deflect downdraft. She hung a red cloth marker above it before the chimney was finished. Tom tied the knot. The second bay became the community shelter. 3 sleeping platforms, 8 inches high, firebrick on rubble, wide enough for 2 adults or 3 children, lined the north and west walls. A fire pit sat in the center, 20 inches wide, identical to the one in Marit's Bay. A double baffle entrance separated the 2 bays so families could move between the private shelter and the shared space without opening the exterior. By late June, the smelter yard had 3 functional heated spaces: Marit's original north bay, the community's second bay, and Ada's cellar shelter 30 yards east. Each operated on the same principles: dense walls, sealed cracks, packed earth roof, small fires, vent with marker, low air inlet, and each produced the same result: interior temperatures that stayed 20 to 30 degrees above exterior temperatures using fuel that a child could carry in a sack. A typical winter day in the smelter yard looked like this. Tom Meeker woke at dawn in the second bay, where he slept on the west platform with his boots beside him and a burlap roll under his head. He fed the fire, 6 twigs, thumb length, and pressed his palm to the floor to check the charge. If the floor was warm, he added nothing. If the floor was cool, he added a second handful. He checked the vent by holding a candle flame near the throat. If the flame pulled toward the throat, the draft was clean. If the flame stood still, he opened the low inlet and waited. If the flame pushed toward him, he killed the fire and went outside to clear the chimney. He did this without thinking about it. The routine had become as automatic as breathing, which was the point. A method that required conscious attention at every step would fail the first time a person was tired or distracted or sick. A method that became habit survived because the person survived. Clara Eide came twice a week to check on the elderly. A retired miner named Josiah Fenn, who slept in the second bay because his cabin had never been properly repaired after the blizzard, and a widow named Ragna Solheim, who had moved into the yard in January when her boarding house room was given to a younger woman who could pay more. Clara brought food when she had extra and questions when she did not. She had learned the candle test, the mortar mix, and the fuel rationing system, and she taught them to her husband, who taught them to his shift partner, who taught them to a family in Stumptown who had been burning 2 cords a month and freezing anyway. The knowledge moved the way all useful knowledge moves in a community that cannot afford experts. Hand to hand, mouth to mouth, mistake to correction, correction to habit. By the autumn of 1889, at least a dozen families in Leadville and the surrounding camps had built some version of the thermal shelter. Some were good. Most were adequate. A few were dangerous. 2 narrow vents, 2 large fires, common brick sold as refractory, and Merritt spent as much time fixing bad copies as she did building new ones. She developed a teaching method, not a lecture, not a diagram, a walkthrough. She brought the student to the brick den and made them build a fire. She watched them reach for large sticks and said, "Smaller." She watched them pile the sticks and said, "Fewer." She watched them light the fire and reach for more fuel immediately and said, "Wait." She pressed their palm to the firebrick floor and made them feel the heat entering the brick. Then she made them wait 5 minutes, 10, 15, until the brick was warm and the twigs were ash. Then she said, "Now, 6 more, the same." The students resisted at first. Every person who had ever sat beside a fire believed that more fire meant more warmth, and the instinct to pile fuel was as deep as the instinct to eat when hungry. Marit's method contradicted the instinct, and contradicting instinct required trust, and trust required proof. So she provided proof. She made them sleep one night in the brick den with nothing but small fires. By morning, when the floor was warm and the air was tolerable and the fuel pile was barely diminished, the proof had done its work. "You are not heating yourself," she told every student. "You are heating the floor. The floor heats you. If you understand this, you will survive. If you do not understand this, no amount of brick will save you." Daniel Ivers arrived in October of 1889 with a freight wagon, a 4-mule team, and a load of broken refractory brick that nobody had ordered. He was 30 years old, born in Pennsylvania, widowed 2 years prior when his wife died of typhoid in a railroad camp outside Salida. He had been hauling freight on the Denver and Rio Grande route since then, ore concentrates, mining timbers, machinery parts, and whatever else would fit in a wagon and pay by the pound. He was quiet in the way that grief makes some men quiet, not withdrawn, not angry, but conserving, as if words had become a finite resource, and he spent them only when the purchase was worthwhile. He had heard about the brick shelter from a teamster in Buena Vista, who had heard it from a shift boss in Leadville who had been in Bell's Mercantile the day Pritchard gave his assessment. The story had traveled the way all good stories travel on freight routes, stripped of detail, concentrated to its essence. A woman, a ruined smelter, brick walls, a dirt roof. She burned twigs while the town burned cords. Ivers did not come to see the shelter. He came to deliver a load of broken refractory brick he had salvaged from a demolished smelter near Salida. The bricks were fractured, halves, thirds, quarter pieces. Too damaged for relining a furnace, but still dense, still heavy, still capable of holding heat. He had loaded them because the weight was free, and the freight route passed through Leadville anyway, and he had heard there was a woman who used broken things. He found Marit in the smelter yard, mixing mortar. "I have a load of broken firebrick," he said, "refractory, from Salida. I do not know if you can use it." Marit looked at the wagon. She walked to the tailgate and picked up a brick fragment. She weighed it in her hand. She tapped it with her knuckle and listened to the ring. She set it on the firebrick floor of the second bay and pressed her palm to it. "Dense," she said. "Good clay. Fractured clean, not crumbled. You can build with half bricks if you mortar the cut faces." "I know," Ivers said. "I grew up around foundries." This was the first thing Marit noticed about him. Not his face, not his build, not his manner, but the fact that he knew what a clean fracture meant. He had looked at the broken brick and seen material, not garbage, the same way she had looked at the smelter ruin and seen shelter, not wreckage. "What do you want for it?" she asked. "Nothing. I had the space. The weight cost me nothing extra, and I heard you were building something worth building." He unloaded the brick himself. Marit tried to help, and he said, "Show me where it goes. I will carry." Not because she was a woman and he was a man, because he had a wagon and a mule team, and she had a broken shovel and a flour sack, and the efficiency was obvious. He stacked the brick where she pointed, along the inside of the east wall, sorted by size, with the largest pieces at the bottom and the fragments on top. He stacked with the precision of a man who had loaded wagons for 2 years and understood that weight improperly placed was weight that would shift and break and become someone else's problem. When the wagon was empty, he watered his mules at the creek and came back to the yard. He looked at the shelter. He looked at the vent chimney, the red marker, the packed earth roof, the double baffle entrance. He walked the perimeter the way Pritchard had walked it on the first day, reading the walls, checking the mortar, tapping brick. "Who designed the chimney?" he asked. "I did, with help from a man named Pritchard." "The angle is good. The hood will shed most downdraft, but the clay lining will crack in a hard freeze if water gets between the lining and the brick. You need a drainage channel at the base of the chimney, inside the wall, 1/2 inch, enough to let seepage run down instead of pooling." Marit looked at the chimney. She had not thought about seepage between the lining and the exterior brick. Pritchard had not mentioned it either, or perhaps he had known and forgotten to say, or perhaps it was a problem specific to angled chimneys that a horizontal furnace throat would not encounter. "How do you know that?" she said. "My father built foundry chimneys in Bethlehem," Ivers said. "Every angled chimney he built had a weep channel. He said water was more patient than fire. Fire comes and goes. Water stays until it wins." Marit looked at Daniel Ivers, a freight hauler with foundry knowledge and a 4-mule team, and the quiet competence of a man who noticed drainage channels in other people's chimneys, and felt something shift behind her ribs that she did not have time to examine. "Can you show me how to cut the channel?" she said. "I can, but I need to make Buena Vista by Thursday. Come back." "I will." He left. Marit stood in the yard and watched the wagon climb the slag road and told herself that what she had felt was gratitude for the brick and interest in the drainage channel and nothing else. She told herself this 3 more times during the evening while she fed the fire and pressed her palm to the floor and thought about weep channels and patient water. Ivers came back 10 days later, and again 2 weeks after that. and again the week after that. Each visit was built around a task: the Weep Channel, a second chimney for the community bay, hauling river rock from a creek bed 2 miles south for a new sleeping platform, repointing mortar joints on the west wall where frost heave had opened cracks. Each task required his wagon, his mules, and his hands, and each task took exactly long enough that he could justify the stop on his freight route without admitting that the stop had become the reason for the route. They work together the way two people work together when both are competent and neither needs instruction, dividing labor by strength and knowledge, communicating in half sentences, disagreeing without argument. Evers was stronger. Marit was more precise. He carried. She measured. He hauled. She placed. He asked questions before lifting, which Marit recognized as the habit of a man who had learned that moving a heavy thing to the wrong place was harder than asking where it went. Courtship on the frontier was not what it was in cities. There were no calling cards, no parlor visits, no chaperone protocols. There was work, and there was the quality of attention a person brought to work, and there was the accumulating evidence measured in shared labor and shared meals and shared silence. The two people were building something besides a wall. Ada noticed first. She said nothing for 3 visits, which was a personal record for Ada Meeker. On the 4th visit, she watched Ivers hand Marit a brick fragment and saw the way his fingers paused against hers for a fraction of a second longer than the transfer required. "He's not coming back for the chimney," Ada told Marit that evening. "He's repointing the west wall." The west wall was fine 2 weeks ago. It had cracks. "Everything has cracks, Marit. The question is whether you want him to fix them." Marit did not answer. She fed the fire. 6 twigs. Wait. By December of 1889, Ivers had rerouted his freight line so that every run passed through Leadville. By January of 1890, he had built a small lean-to against the east wall of the smelter for his mules. By February, Ada told him he might as well bring his trunk inside because the mules were warmer than he was pretending to be. Daniel Ivers and Marit Breck married in March of 1890 in the Methodist Church on Harrison Avenue, with Ada as witness and Tom Meeker carrying a pouch of rice he had bought with his own earnings from masonry work. Pritchard sent a letter from Pueblo congratulating them and correcting a diagram Marit had mailed him showing a modified chimney angle. The correction was unnecessary. The chimney worked. But Pritchard could not look at a diagram without checking the geometry, and Marit could not receive a correction without smiling. They did not leave the smelter yard. They expanded into it. Ivers framed a proper entrance, timber built, with a real door on iron hinges, connecting the north bay to the second bay and enclosing the space between them as a storage room. Marit added a third heated space, a small chamber built against the furnace throat's exterior wall, using the throat's residual heat to warm a room she used for drying laundry. The laundry room was not efficient. It was not necessary. It was the first thing Marit had built for comfort instead of survival, and Ada said that was how you knew the crisis was over, when a person started building things they wanted instead of things they needed. Tom Meeker left school at 14 and apprenticed himself to masonry work, which in Leadville meant repairing chimneys, relining stove hearths, and building the kind of thermal shelters that Marit had made ordinary. He was the first person besides Marit to teach the method publicly, standing in the brick den with a candle and a handful of twigs, pressing a student's palm to the floor, saying the words Marit had taught him, "You are not heating yourself. You are heating the floor." He refused to build any shelter without a second air path. This was not a preference. It was a rule he carried from the night when he was 12 years old, sitting on a firebrick floor with smoke pooling at the ceiling and a woman he barely knew killing the fire to save his lungs. He remembered the smoke. He remembered the sound of Marit crawling on the roof in the storm, searching for the vent. He remembered the moment the low inlet cleared and fresh air poured across the floor, and he could breathe again. Every shelter Tom Meeker built had two ways for air to enter. He told his clients this was Pritchard's rule. It was. But it was also the rule written into his body by 14 hours of being 12 years old and sealed in a brick room with 5 other people while the mountain tried to bury them. The years compress the way years do when a life stops being an emergency and becomes a practice. By the mid-1890s, Leadville's silver boom had collapsed. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act's repeal in 1893 destroyed the price of silver and threw the town into unemployment, foreclosure, and departure. Mines closed, smelters shut down. Men who had earned $4 a day went to earning nothing. Families who had been comfortable became desperate, and families who had been desperate became something for which Leadville did not have a polite word. The thermal shelters became valuable again, not as a curiosity, not as the Norwegian widow's strange experiment, but as the difference between staying and leaving. A family that could heat a small space with twigs and coal crumbs did not need to buy 6 cords of pine at $12 a cord. A family that could sleep in a cellar lined with slag brick and covered with sod did not need to pay $2 a week for a boarding house bed. The method did not solve poverty. Nothing solved poverty. But it reduced the cost of one essential shelter from cold to nearly zero. And in a town where every dollar had been spoken for twice, nearly zero was the only number that mattered. Marit and Daniel did not become wealthy. They became necessary. He hauled materials, brick fragments, poles, sod, mortar ingredients, on a route that no longer paid for freight because the mines that generated freight had closed. She taught, inspected, repaired, and argued. They ate beans and salt pork and the occasional deer that Daniel brought from the timber above the gulch, and they fed the fire the same way Merritt had fed it since the beginning: 6 twigs, thumb length, weight. Ada Meeker ran a laundry from a banked brick room she had built with her own hands from slag brick, river rock, and lessons learned from a floor that stayed warm when the rest of Leadville shivered. She became the second person to teach the method publicly, and she taught it with the directness that had always defined her. Small fire, dense walls, sealed cracks, 2 air paths. If you do not understand why, come back tomorrow, and I will explain it with a candle. Pritchard wrote from Pueblo every few months. His letters were technical, assessments of chimney designs Marit sent him, corrections to mortar formulas, questions about vent performance in different wind conditions. Occasionally, a sentence of personal warmth would appear between the specifications, like a crack in a mortar joint through which something human leaked. I trust you are well. The foundry work is tedious. I miss the sound of brick being laid by someone who listens to it. His last letter arrived in the spring of 1897. It contained a correction to a diagram Tom Meeker had drawn of a modified 2-flue chimney, a note that his niece had given birth to a daughter named Catherine, and a single sentence at the bottom of the page. The plumb bob tells the truth. I hope the walls still answer. Marit wrote back. The letter was returned 6 weeks later, marked with a notation she did not recognize. Ada, whose cursive was better, read it. Addressee deceased, return to sender. Evan Pritchard had died in his sleep in Pueblo, Colorado, at the age of 58, with foundry specifications on his bedside table and a mason's chisel he could no longer hold wrapped in oilcloth in his trunk. Marit took the plumb bob from her belt and hung it from a nail above the fire pit in the North Bay. It hung there for the rest of her life, a brass weight on a cotton line, turning slowly in the warm air rising from the firebrick floor, pointing always toward the center of the earth the way its owner had always pointed toward the truth of a thing, whether or not the truth was welcome. She did not stop working. She worked the way Pritchard had taught her to work, by checking, by testing, by tapping the wall and listening to the ring. She added a fourth heated space to the smelter yard, a small room for storage and tool repair, and she lined it with the last of the Salida refractory brick that Daniel had delivered on his first visit. She repaired Tom Meeker's first solo chimney project when the clay lining cracked in a freeze, and she said nothing about the weep channel he had forgotten because he found the error himself the next morning and fixed it before she could point. Daniel built a corral for the mules and a small stable with a sod roof and stone walls. The stable was not a thermal shelter. The mules generated their own heat, but the principles were the same: dense walls, sealed gaps, a vent that drew. Merritt caught him pressing his palm to the stable wall one morning to check the stone's temperature and laughed for the first time since Pritchard's death. "You are checking the mule's floor," she said. "The mules deserve a warm floor," Daniel said. "The mules are standing on dirt." "The mules do not know the difference. I know the difference. That is enough." They had no children of their own. Tom Meeker was the closest thing, a boy they had not raised but had shaped, who carried their knowledge in his hands and their principles in his habits, and who, by the turn of the century, was the most sought-after chimney mason in Lake County. He built thermal shelters and repaired heating systems, and refused every shortcut that Quade's legacy of cheap materials and careless construction had normalized. He tested every brick he laid. He tapped every wall he built. He checked every vent he installed with a candle flame, and when the flame pulled toward the throat, he moved on. And when it did not, he stopped and fixed the problem before the problem found someone sleeping. Quade himself had left Leadville in 1894, following the money to Cripple Creek when the gold strikes there drew the same men who had exhausted Leadville's silver. He sold his rooming house shares, settled his debts at a discount, and departed on the Denver and Rio Grande with a trunk that was lighter than the one he arrived with. He was not punished. He was not ruined. He was simply outgrown, a man whose method of profiting from other people's needs had been replaced by a community that had learned to meet its own. His parting words to no one in particular, overheard by a clerk at the depot, were, "That town deserves its brick." Whether he meant it as an insult or a concession, nobody could tell. It did not matter. Leadville kept the brick. Marit Brecka Evers lived out her later years in the expanded smelter shelter on the eastern edge of Leadville, within sight of California Gulch, and the slag heaps that had once been the ugliest thing she had ever seen, and had become, over time, the landscape of the only home she had earned with her own hands. She never owned much beyond tools, blankets, the plumb bob that hung above the fire pit, and the firebrick floor that had taught her everything her father had known and everything Pritchard had added, and everything the storms and the floods and the failures had forced her to learn for herself. She became the person people fetched when a roof sagged, a vent smoked, or a family had more winter than fuel. Daniel died in 1903 from a lung ailment that the doctor attributed to years of breathing smelter dust and mine tailings on the freight roads. Marit was 40 when she buried him on the hillside above the gulch, in a plot she chose by walking the slope with the plumb bob and testing the grade the way she tested everything, by asking the ground a question and waiting for the answer. She lived another 11 years in the brick den, alone but not isolated, feeding the fire the same way she had fed it since the beginning. Tom Meeker checked on her every morning. Ada brought bread on Sundays. The fire pit never went cold. She died in 1914 in the North Bay on the fire brick floor, in the warmth of a fire that her neighbors kept burning for 3 days after she stopped breathing, because nobody could bring themselves to let the brick go cold. Hot. By the time Leadville's boom years faltered and the town settled into the quieter life of a place that had been important and was now merely inhabited, dozens of families knew the rule Marit Brecka had made visible. Do not only feed a fire, teach the walls to remember it. The relief committee kept diagrams in the schoolhouse, drawn on pine boards in charcoal, and corrected in Pritchard's hand from 600 miles away. Ada Meeker taught women how to test draft with a candle flame. Tom Meeker marked every safe vent with red cloth before the first deep snow, a habit he continued into his 60s, long after the need had faded and the gesture had become ritual. Marit Brecka Ivers lived and died in the same furnace bay the town had called a grave. She never traveled farther than Buena Vista after 1887. She never earned more than a laundress's wage. She never published, never lectured, never received recognition from anyone who had not stood inside her shelter and felt the floor. But the method outlived the method's name, and the principle outlived the person who had proven it, and the families who slept warm on firebrick floors in the winters after the silver crashed did not always remember who had taught them. They remembered the rule: small fire, dense walls, sealed cracks. The floor holds what you give it. The town had said she was roofing a furnace grave with willow sticks. They said it at Bell's Mercantile, and on the Slag Road, and in the boarding house where her bed had been rented to a paying man 3 days after her husband died. Martin Quaid had walked into the yard with 2 men and called the brick worth more than she was. Evan Pritchard had stood in the entrance gap and told her she had twigs where she needed tons. Years later, after another storm, one of the dozens that would cross that gulch in the decades after Marit Brecka first pressed her palm to a warm wall and understood what her father had meant. Children stood inside that same brick chamber with their mittens off, palms flat against the firebrick, feeling the warmth that moved through the dense clay like breath, like memory, like something given that the stone had chosen to hold. Outside, the cold still owned the gulch. The wind still drove snow sideways across the slag heaps. The wooden cabins that remained still groaned and leaked and demanded their 6 cords of fuel to keep the air warm enough to survive. Inside, the last handful of twigs had burned to ash, and the brick was still giving back what it was given. The town had mistaken ruins for failure because it had forgotten that some things are strongest after surviving fire.